Good morning, once again, colleagues, excellencies, Excellencies, colleagues, distinguished guests, the 54th session of the Human Rights Council is now open. Before we begin, I understand that the distinguished permanent representative of the Gambia, Ambassador Carr, has requested the floor for an important request. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Under such circumstances, as we all are aware, just 3 days ago, a devastating earthquake I think it's a symbol of a very good summer. Thank you, Mr. President. It deeply saddens me to address you under such circumstances. As we are all aware, just 3 days ago, a devastating earthquake struck the Kingdom of Morocco, claiming thousands of innocent lives and causing immeasurable damage to properties. We must remember that behind every statistic lies a story of parents, children, friends, and treasured members of families. They symbolize shattered dreams and uncertain future. This tragic event reminds us of the temporary nature of life and our collective vulnerability. As we gather here, it is essential to remember that we are not just representatives of nations or organizations. We are part of a global community, humanity. It is our collective responsibility to stand together in solidarity during times of distress and disaster, and of course in good times. In light of this recent tragedy, I humbly request this esteemed Council to observe a minute of silence in remembrance of those lost in Morocco and a symbol of our collective commitment to support and stand by each other in these challenging times. Therefore, Mr. President, I respectfully ask the esteemed Council to rise and join me in observing a minute of silence. Let us honor those who perished in Morocco and affirm our unwavering support for one another during trying times. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Now let me invite the representative of Morocco. Morocco, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, c'est la gorge nouée par l'émotion. L'esprit et le cœur accablés par le deuil que je prends la parole ce matin pour vous remercier tous, membres du Conseil, honorable audience, société civile, pour ce geste de solidarité, de compassion et de recueillement que vous venez d'exprimer à l'endroit des nombreuses victimes innocentes de ce séisme violent qui a secoué et frappé mon pays dans la nuit du samedi. J'ai été témoin, Monsieur le Président, depuis cette nuit, d'un élan de solidarité et d'expression de sympathie effective et je dirais affective de l'ensemble de la Genève internationale sans exception. Nous sommes au Maroc très reconnaissants à l'endroit, comme vient de le souligner mon cher frère, le professeur K, son Excellence l'ambassadeur de la Gambie, nous avons perçu la fraternité humaine dans son expression la plus chaleureuse et la plus profonde. Tout est fait actuellement, comme vous le savez, dans le Royaume, pour porter secours aux victimes et bien sûr pour sauver les vies avant tout. Sur place, les efforts considérables sont menés, malgré les difficultés très importantes parfois, le fait que ce séisme a frappé le cœur des montagnes de l'Atlas au Maroc, à des altitudes très hautes, ce qui a causé des dommages aux infrastructures. Nonobstant cela, nos autorités, guidées par Sa Majesté le roi Mohammed VI du Maroc, qui conduit personnellement les efforts d'arrache-pied pour surmonter ces difficultés, les efforts se déploient avec la présence aussi de l'aide internationale, de l'expertise déjà sur place. Sa Majesté le roi n'a pas manqué, lors d'une réunion tenue avant-hier, de remercier personnellement tous les pays, toutes les institutions, toutes les agences et bien sûr aussi les ONG et la société civile qui sont accourus au secours de nos victimes. Nous sommes, Monsieur le Président, frappés par cet événement, mais mon peuple, les Marocains, sont connus aussi pour leur résilience et particulièrement pour ce qui concerne les populations vivant dans cette région. Nous allons surmonter ces difficultés et ce matin, je voudrais aussi à nouveau vous remercier tous ici présents pour cette expression de solidarité que vous avez exprimée. Je voudrais ne pas manquer de dire que par leur propre initiative, et cela est tout à l'honneur des institutions internationales présentes ici à Genève, sans exception, elles ont fait preuve d'un esprit de solidarité, d'initiative à l'endroit de mon pays. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Encore une fois, merci de tout cœur.
Merci, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur. Now, let me go back to the agenda. It is my honor to welcome Mr. Volker Turk, High Commissioner for Human Rights, and I would like to also warmly welcome all of you who will be participating at the Council session, both in the room as well as those online. Myanmar in the Human Rights Council in 2023. During its meeting on 5th September, the Bureau noted that the General Assembly had still not made a decision on the representation of Myanmar. Therefore, Myanmar would not be represented in the Council's 54th session. In line with the decision taken by the Council since 2021, the Bureau agreed to propose to the Council that the two interactive dialogues on Myanmar scheduled to take place during the 54th session take place as scheduled without the participation of the country concerned. And now I seek the agreement of the Council on the proposal that the interactive dialogue on the report of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar and the interactive dialogue on the report of the High Commissioner on overall situation of human rights in Myanmar proceed as scheduled without the participation of the country concerned. Such a proposal is made on the basis that this is exceptional circumstance and it doesn't set a precedent for the future. Are there any members of the Council wishing to comment on this proposal? Since I don't see any, I understand that there are no objections to the Bureau's proposal and we can proceed with the two interactive dialogues on Myanmar as scheduled without the participation of the country concerned. And it is so decided. Colleagues, now let me propose that the Council approves the draft programme of work with the understanding that it is a living document. Do any members of the Council wish to comment on this proposal? And since I see no objection, the programme of work for the session is approved. Colleagues, the online system to inscribe on the lists of speakers for all interactive dialogues, panel discussions and general debates opened on Tuesday, 5th September and closes 24 hours before the meeting in which the respective debate is scheduled to start. Once the online inscription is closed, delegations can still inscribe or withdraw by sending an email to the list of speakers desk. The list of speakers will close approximately 15 minutes after the beginning of each debate, and I kindly ask all delegations to respect the deadlines. Further information on making changes to the list of speakers can be found in the minutes of the Bureau meeting of June 30th of this year. The online system for inscription on the list of speakers for the adoption of UPR outcomes will open on Monday, 18th September at 9 a.m. and will close on Thursday, September 21st at 6 p.m. No inscriptions will be possible after this deadline. For national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations, the list of speakers for all debates opened on Tuesday, September the 5th. I kindly request all participants to upload the word version of their oral statements through the online system for the list of speakers. I also encourage all of you to respect the speaking time limits, which I will strictly apply. Excellencies, colleagues, the deadline for the submission of draft proposals for the 54th session is set for Wednesday, October 4th at 1 p.m. The submission of a proposal after this deadline needs prior approval by the Council before it is registered by the Secretariat. Any request for extension would be approved by the Council only under exceptional circumstances and for a maximum of 24 hours. I encourage sponsors to table their draft proposals as early as possible. Let me also emphasize that in accordance with Resolution 5/1, delegations are invited to conduct open-ended informal consultations to secure the broadest possible support for their initiatives. At least one open-ended informal consultation should be held on each draft resolution and/or decision before it is considered for action by the Council. In the interest of ensuring the effective participation of all stakeholders in our work, I encourage main sponsors of draft proposals to share draft texts with civil society organizations and other observers that follow informal consultations. Colleagues, a constructive and safe and respectful atmosphere is essential for the Council's sessions. It is unacceptable that the Council's mandate holders are sometimes subjected to personal insults, attacks, or threats in the course of the foundation of the Human Rights Council. I call on everyone to take all necessary steps to prevent any act of reprisal or intimidation committed against individuals or groups who have cooperated with the Council, its mechanisms and procedures. And in the case that such an act does occur, ensure that it is promptly and seriously addressed. I assure you that as President I will follow up on all reported allegations of acts of reprisal and intimidation committed against individuals or groups who have cooperated with the Council. With regard to the accessibility of our work, in accordance with its Resolution 16/21, the Council established a task force to reflect on improving access and participation of persons with disabilities in the work of the Council. His Excellency, Mr. Muhammadou Kah, is serving as the chair of the task force on accessibility, and there is a focal point for accessibility within the Secretariat who can be contacted if necessary. Delegations are requested to upload their oral statements in Word format so that they can be accessible to persons with disabilities. Statements uploaded in PDF or other non-accessible formats will not be posted on the extranet. I would like to also invite delegations to consider requesting accessibility in mandated panel discussions to ensure live captioning and sign language interpretation. Excellencies, colleagues, I wish to emphasize that the United Nations, including this Council, has a zero tolerance for any form of harassment, including sexual harassment. The UNOC Director General has pledged to implement the Code of Conduct to prevent harassment, including sexual harassment, at the UN system event. The Council's gender focal point, Her Excellency Usha Chandi Dwarka-Kanabe, is assisting with the implementation of the Code of Conduct in the Council. All complaints will be dealt with promptly. And let me stop here with technical and organizational information. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, I now declare open Agenda Item 2 entitled Annual Report of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and Reports of the Office of the High Commissioner and the Secretary General. This agenda item will remain open throughout the session. We will now proceed with the oral update of the High Commissioner. Let me remind you that the general debate on this oral update will begin tomorrow afternoon after the oral update by the group of experts on Nicaragua. And now I have the pleasure to give the floor to the High Commissioner for Human Rights to present his oral update. Sir, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, in my work with the United Nations, it has become clear to me that development issues underlie almost every issue, every challenge that we face. People everywhere want and have a right to a decent standard of living, food on the table, and access to affordable medical care when they need it, education and equal opportunities for themselves and their children, good economic prospects with a fair share of resources, a clean, healthy and sustainable environment, the freedom to make their own choices, objective information, not propaganda, justice and police systems that uphold their rights. And to ensure all of this, they want active and meaningful participation in decisions and governments that serve their needs, not elites whose needs they have to serve. But time and again, I see people deprived of these rights and crushed by development that is neither respectful nor fair. Injustice, poverty, exploitation and repression are the cause of grievances that drive tensions, conflicts, displacement and further misery, and on and on. Mr. President, last month in Iraq, the cradle of so many civilizations, I witnessed a small piece of the environmental horror that is our global planetary crisis. In Basra, where 30 years ago, I was told, date palms lined lush canals, drought, searing heat, extreme pollution and fast depleting supplies of fresh water are creating barren landscapes of rubble and dust. This spiraling damage is a human rights emergency for Iraq and many other countries. Climate change is pushing millions of people into famine. It is destroying hopes, opportunities, homes and lives. In recent months, urgent warnings have become lethal realities again and again all around the world. We do not need more warnings. The dystopian future is already here. We need urgent action now, and we know what to do. The real question is, what stops us? Mr. President, instead of unity of purpose and decisive cooperative leadership, we are seeing the politics of division and distraction. For instance, through the fabrication of artificial disputes over gender, migration, or imagining a clash of civilizations. The repugnant series of some 30 incidents of burning the Quran recently is the latest manifestation of this urge to polarize and fragment, to create divisions within societies and between countries. I will discuss this in more detail on the 6th of October in line with Resolution 53/1. We are also seeing the politics of indifference, the numbing of our mind and soul, an effort to deflect our innermost feature, compassion, by simply negating the humanity of victims and people vulnerable to harm. I'm shocked by the nonchalance that becomes apparent in the face of more than 2,300 people reported dead or missing in the Mediterranean this year, including the loss of more than 600 lives in a single shipwreck off Greece in June. It is evident that far more migrants and refugees are dying unnoticed in the seas around Europe, including the Channel, in the Bay of Bengal, and in the Caribbean, where people seeking protection are constantly pushed back and deported to situations of grave danger. Or along the US-Mexican border, where deportations and expedited removal processes raise serious issues. Or at the border of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, where my office is seeking urgent clarification about allegations of killings and mistreatment. We are also seeing the politics of deception, of throwing sand in people's eyes. Helped by new technologies, lies and disinformation are mass-produced to sow chaos, to confuse, and ultimately to deny reality and ensure that no action will be taken that could endanger the entrenched interests of elites. The most apparent case of this is climate change. And we are seeing the old, blunt, brutal politics of repression. We so badly need a flowering of critical, innovative and constructive views to build better policies and systems. But what we increasingly get are military coups, authoritarianism and the crushing of dissent. In short, the fist. Antidotes exist to each of these. We need to insist on evidence and truth. We need to be mindful of our interconnectedness and shared values. We need to cultivate humanity's natural reflexes of empathy, justice and compassion. We need to nourish the critical thinking and creativity that can only stem from broad, free participation and open debates. And we need to stand firm on the promise of human rights, which is a promise of solutions. Just as injustices crash into each other and generate multiple towering crises, so joined-up steps towards more justice, respect and inclusion will anchor resilience and liberate the power of contributions from every member of society. Sustainable Development Goal 16 encapsulates our way out and forward from the turbulence that we are experiencing. Its emphasis on this interlocking relationship between good governance and development represents the linchpin that holds the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development together. Every development goal is grounded in equality and human dignity. They all require accountable institutions, an impartial, independent rule of law, and vibrant civil society. SDG 16 makes clear that to advance development, states have the responsibility to guarantee and protect civic space and fundamental rights. Leaving no one behind is not an empty slogan. It is a human rights action plan that reaches across the whole spectrum of human rights. Freedom is both the goal of development and its source. Civil, political, economic, social and cultural rights, the right to development, and the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment all build on each other. This is the meaning of the indivisibility and interdependence of human rights. Moving forward together, they can contribute to real solutions to our most pressing issues and challenges. The separation between two distinct sets of rights, civil and political on the one hand, economic, social and cultural on the other, is an artifact of ideologies, not borne out by reality. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights establishes no such separation or hierarchy, and 75 years after its adoption, we badly need to return to its core. Human rights are and must be politically neutral. All states have accepted their responsibility to realize all rights. And my mandate and ambition are to help every country advance and uphold the full range of human rights without distinction as to their political system, alliances or stage of development. Mr. President, it is against this backdrop and also in light of the upcoming SDG summit next week that I will focus this address on development and human rights. The world is betraying our promise to end hunger by 2030. Despite financial resources, technological innovation and land sufficient to provide adequate food for all, we have returned to hunger levels not seen since 2005, and to their toll of stunted children and painfully abbreviated lives. The FAO's 2023 global report projects that almost 600 million people will be chronically undernourished at the end of this decade. Causal factors include climate change, the consequences of the pandemic, and Russia's war on Ukraine. A year and a half of horrific warfare has ravaged Ukraine, with heart-wrenching toll on its people and damage to vast areas of agricultural land. The Russian Federation's withdrawal from the Black Sea Grain Initiative in July and attacks on grain facilities in Odessa and elsewhere have again forced prices sky high in many developing countries, taking the right to food far out of reach for many people. In Somalia, years of drought, extremist violence and failed governance led to an estimated 43,000 excess deaths last year. Roughly half of them children under 5 years old. Some 1.8 million children are likely to be acutely malnourished through 2023, a tragedy of inhuman proportions in a country that has so deeply been affected by conflict. Somalia's long dependence on wheat imports from Ukraine and the Russian Federation means that the breakdown of the Black Sea Grain Initiative was particularly damaging. Hunger and food insecurity are also deeply concerning in the Caribbean. The May 2023 WFP CARICOM survey found that 3.7 million people, or 52% of the population of CARICOM countries, were food insecure. In Haiti, extreme gang violence, fueled by decades of poor governance, is making an already bad food situation worse. Nearly half the population, 4.9 million people, experiences acute food insecurity. Yet in some parts of the country it is possible and safe to produce food, and these local initiatives must be better supported. The report on Haiti that will be presented to the Council during this session indicates clearly that poverty, inequalities and violations of economic, social and cultural rights have been the breeding ground of the unbearable violence and wide-ranging crisis the country faces today. Across 111 countries, 1.2 billion people, nearly half of them children, now live in acute multidimensional poverty. They represent almost 20% of those countries' populations, and according to the World Bank, many millions more will be pushed into extreme poverty as a result of climate change. This is a terrible collective human rights failure. Across the Sahel, most people struggle for daily survival, with Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali and Niger among the 8 least developed countries in the world. These countries are severely affected by environmental degradation and climate change, a crisis to which they have contributed almost nothing. Resources required for survival, such as fertile land and water, are diminishing, resulting in conflict between communities. The adaptation measures that they so urgently need are far too costly, and the financial support that is regularly promised at international conferences trickles in too slowly. 2022 was the deadliest year since the beginning of the Sahel crisis a decade ago, and the constant threat of violence by armed groups is now expanding towards coastal states. None of the challenges faced by these countries can be addressed in isolation. They are interlinked. Climate change, including related droughts and extreme weather events, failure to invest adequately in education, healthcare, sanitation, social protections, impartial justice and human rights, decades of weak governance and a lack of transparent and accountable decision-making are the sources that violent extremism draws from. The unconstitutional changes in government that we have seen in the Sahel are not the solution. We need instead an urgent reversal to civilian governance and open spaces where people can participate, influence, accompany and criticize government actions or lack of action. Mr. President, ours is an age of massive concentration of wealth and unprecedented inequalities. Global wealth has never been greater. But in 2021, the richest 10% owned 76% of total wealth. The poorest half owned just 2%. And nearly half of the world's people live in countries where governments must spend more on debt repayment than they are able to do on education and health. The abyss between rich and poor harms everyone. Nationally and internationally, it destroys trust and weakens efforts to find solutions. It is in the interest of every state to ensure that all international institutions and multilateral discussions reflect the needs of each and every participant, and that they work to close the widening inequalities between countries. One important step must be the reform of the international financial architecture, including fairer deals on debt relief and development finance. Often, unwarranted conditionalities in investment and loan agreements have obstructed states' fulfillment of their human rights obligations, as if the latter obligations didn't exist. Human rights are central to development impact and a just transition, and they must be integrated clearly and comprehensively in the policies and operations of international financial institutions. I also strongly encourage states to endorse the UN's appeal for an SDG stimulus. And I welcome the current international discussions on reinforcing international tax cooperation. When multinational businesses and wealthy individuals shift their profits and financial reporting to low or no tax jurisdictions, this undercuts the ability of countries to mobilize revenues to fulfill human rights. The 2023 State of Tax Justice Report estimates that countries will lose nearly $5 trillion over the next 10 years to tax havens. We need to combat tax avoidance, tax evasion, and illicit financial flows. I commend the leadership of the African Group for bringing this topic to the fore of the General Assembly, and I welcome the initiative led by Colombia, Chile, and Brazil to promote progressive taxation and greater cooperation across Latin America and the Caribbean. Taking decisive steps to end corruption and illicit financial flows is a powerful tool for raising revenue, as studies have found. Both phenomena also undermine the rule of law, taking away resources needed for public investments and the common good, and destroying public confidence. Studies indicate that up to 25% of spending on public contracts is stolen by corruption globally. This deeply corrosive impact on sustainable development is why SDG 16.5 makes a strong promise, and I quote, to substantially reduce corruption and bribery in all its forms. With the planetary crisis gaining pace, there is also a vital need for a shift to human rights economies that promote green solutions. I cannot emphasize too strongly the need for a rapid, equitable phase-out of fossil fuels and effectively financed human rights-based climate action, notably for adaptation and to address loss and damage. I'm also attentive to the need to counter the impunity of people and businesses who severely plunder our environment. An international crime of ecocide has been proposed for inclusion in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court by a number of states and civil society. I welcome consideration of this and other measures to expand accountability for environmental damage both at the national and international level. Mr. President, the rights to affordable and quality food, water and sanitation, housing, education, healthcare, and social security impose obligations on all states. Like all other human rights, they need to be embedded in law and upheld everywhere. But in many countries, housing, for example, is treated as a commodity for speculative investment, a plaything of financial markets rather than a fundamental right. A crisis of affordable housing squeezes family incomes, deepens inequalities, harms the health of children, impoverishes young people, and drives a growing crisis of homelessness. This has become especially evident across much of the industrialized world, and I'm highlighting this issue because I'm convinced that it goes to the heart of the social contract. The apparent indifference of elected officials to the plight of young people and others contributes to their disillusionment, eroding their trust in political systems. In many European countries, housing costs have risen far faster than incomes, putting stable, secure housing out of reach for large numbers of young people and others with low or erratic incomes. Across the European Union, a 2023 report based on official data indicates that nearly 1 million people are homeless, almost 30% higher than the already high level in 2021. And it finds that young people are among the most impacted. In the United States of America, more than 500,000 people were experiencing homelessness in January 2022, according to official figures, and over 40% of them were people of African descent, who make up 12% of the population. By dint of concerted action, Finland has seen significant reductions in homelessness since 2010. This has included substantial housing allowances for people living on low incomes, targeted social support services, and proactive policies to develop the stock of rental housing. In response to what's happening within the European Union, a European platform on combating homelessness was established in 2021 to help coordinate action across the EU by government, cities and civil society. Similarly, in the US, the new federal strategic plan to prevent and end homelessness is another signal of a new impetus to achieve corrective action. Ending homelessness and ensuring affordable housing are firmly embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals. They are also a human rights imperative. States need to recognize homelessness as a violation of human rights that strips people of protection essential to dignity. I encourage all countries, particularly the most developed countries, to deploy maximum available resources to fulfill these rights as required by international law. Mr. President, across the Middle East and North Africa, people are facing unprecedented water scarcity. An estimated 83% of the region's population is exposed to extremely high water stress, and by 2030, average per capita available water will fall below the threshold of absolute scarcity. This will have dramatic negative impact on health and food security. It will drastically intensify poverty, and it appears likely to increase conflicts, instability and displacement. Serious governance issues and failure to invest in the infrastructure for rights helped cause this crisis, together with climate change, pollution and population growth. This is an almost textbook example of the interlocking relationship between inclusive institutions, good governance and fulfillment, or failure to fulfill development goals. Governance reforms, including much broader space for civil society and human rights defenders to work for the common good, can better equip societies to react, adapt and build resilience to decreasing water access. Water is just one example of the need to ensure inclusive governance in the context of development. China's drive for development has brought powerful achievements in alleviating poverty. But the country's recent economic challenges highlight the need for a more participatory approach that upholds all human rights, including the rights of members of ethnic minorities, people in rural communities, internal migrant workers, older people, and people with disabilities. Opening the space for civil society participation and debate, including when this is critical of policies and advocates change, builds a more resilient and flexible society. As my office highlighted a year ago, the concerns in the Xinjiang UER require strong remedial action by the authorities as per our recommendations. I also remain troubled by the continued detention of human rights advocates. In El Salvador, putting an end to decades of unbridled gang criminality is a complex challenge. Root causes of this security crisis include governance deficits, inequalities and lack of access to fundamental economic, social and cultural rights. Addressing these would contribute to better, more sustainable solutions. I am concerned about the excessive duration of the current state of emergency and mass detentions which have occurred in this context, as well as unacceptable prison conditions and restrictions of civic space and due process. In Mexico, poverty rates have decreased notably, with over 5 million people moving out of poverty between 2018 and 2022, an achievement worth celebrating. At the same time, recent data indicates an increase in the number of people who report a lack of access to healthcare services. This underlines the need for more sustainable progress towards the full realization of economic, social and cultural rights, anchored by institutions that are inclusive, transparent and accountable. A milestone decision by the Supreme Court last week found criminal penalties for abortion in the Federal Penal Code unconstitutional, another advance in Latin America regarding women's rights. I encourage all countries to enable women to choose to terminate pregnancy safely. I welcome last month's discussions by Brazil, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, Guyana, Peru, Suriname and Venezuela towards a common vision for the Amazon rainforest, including effective participation by indigenous peoples. The announcement in June that Brazil will aim to end illegal deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon by 2030 comes as a breath of fresh air. I also congratulate the people of Ecuador for their votes in favor of stopping oil and mineral extraction activities in Yasuní National Park, which is also home to indigenous peoples, and the Andean Chocó Biosphere Reserve. In Australia, a referendum will take place next month on constitutional recognition of the first peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament. This is a historic opportunity to lay a new foundation for the inclusion and participation of indigenous peoples for the benefit of all Australians. In India, my office frequently receives information that marginalized minority communities are subjected to violence and discrimination. Muslims are often the target of such attacks, most recently in Haryana and Gurugram in northern India. In Manipur, other communities have also been facing violence and insecurity since May. There is a clear need to redouble efforts to uphold the rights of all minorities by dealing in a forthright manner with intolerance, hate speech, religious extremism and discrimination. I remain profoundly shocked by the escalating violence in the occupied Palestinian territory as more Palestinians and Israelis, including children, continue to be killed and seriously injured. The use of airstrikes in the occupied West Bank is especially concerning. Violent attacks by settlers against Palestinians appear to be growing more common and in some cases have taken place with the apparent acquiescence of Israeli forces. Illegal settlements are also expanding greatly. The government's purported application of sovereignty over the occupied West Bank and the transfer of wide administrative powers from military authorities to Israeli civilian officials are inconsistent with international humanitarian law. I am also concerned by continuing civic space restrictions by the Palestinian authorities and de facto authorities in Gaza, including through arbitrary detention of those perceived to be voicing their criticism. The Gaza de facto authorities continue to impose the death penalty, including against non-security personnel convicted by military courts. I reiterate my deep concerns regarding human rights developments in the Russian Federation. Civic space is being crushed by restrictions on fundamental rights and particularly severe oppression of the anti-war movement. The authorities continue to use the judicial system to silence critical voices, targeting human rights activists and groups for legitimate work. The sentences handed down to opposition politicians and independent journalists, such as the additional 19-year prison sentence for Alexei Navalny and 25 years for Vladimir Kara-Murza, raise serious concerns both for these individuals and for the rule of law. Allegations of torture and ill treatment in detention facilities persists, as does the authorities' unwillingness to investigate. In Iran, a year after Mahsa Amini's death, I am seriously concerned that a new bill currently under review imposes severe penalties on women and girls who do not obey the compulsory dress code, including through travel bans and withdrawal of access to social services. It also enables the use of surveillance technology to monitor women's behavior and dress. Reports of women facing legal action for dress code violations have multiplied even before passage of the bill. In this context, I flag my concern regarding renewed deployment of the morality police, a force almost exclusively aimed at controlling women and girls. Accountability for Mrs. Amini's death and for violations in the context of subsequent protests has been inadequate. Use of the death penalty has risen sharply, notably against the Baloch and others from minority communities. In Pakistan, I'm concerned by the use of blasphemy allegations to incite violence against minority communities and instigate communal tensions. Last month, a mob of thousands of people burned down more than a dozen churches and looted homes of Christians in an area of Faisalabad. Draft amendments to the country's already severe blasphemy laws would sharply increase penalties. Passage of this legislation would constitute a major step away from the changes urged by international human rights bodies. In Ethiopia's Amhara region, since the start of the crisis and the declaration of a state of emergency at the beginning of August, over 1,000 people have reportedly been arrested and more than 200 reportedly killed in the context of clashes between federal forces and Amhara Fano militia. In Oromia, clashes also reportedly continue to lead to killings and other violations and abuses. In Tigray, mass arrests and forced displacement are reported mainly in areas where Eritrean and Amhara forces are still allegedly present. All these incidents must be investigated and those responsible held to account. I note the progress that has been made in transitional justice consultations, and I urge continued dialogue with all stakeholders, including women. I also encourage transitional justice and accountability. In both Libya and Tunisia, I have been alarmed by reports that authorities have been carrying out mass arrests and collective expulsions of migrants and asylum seekers from south of the Sahara. As of 31 August, at least 28 migrants have reportedly died from heat and thirst in desert areas in the Libya-Tunisia border after some 2,000 migrants and asylum seekers, including women and children, were left there by Tunisian authorities with no or limited access to food, water and shelter. In Tunisia, many more migrants remain at risk of expulsion. Over the past 5 months, security agencies in both West and East Libya have also conducted mass arrests of migrants and refugees, followed by expulsions. I urge the application of human rights guidance which offers benefits to both countries, to countries of origin, transit and destination. In Lebanon, 3 years after the Beirut explosion, which killed over 200 people and wounded more than 7,000, including over 1,000 children, there has been no accountability. On the contrary, numerous concerns have been raised about interference into the investigation against a backdrop of severe economic and social crisis and weak governance. It may therefore be time to consider an international fact-finding mission to look into human rights violations related to this tragedy. In Cameroon, 6 years of crisis in the northwest and southwest regions have claimed several thousand lives, displaced an estimated 725,000 people, and left at least 1.7 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. The impact on human rights and development has been massive. I acknowledge steps by the authorities towards a major national dialogue, including a national consultation on ending hate speech, establishment of a public independent conciliator in the northwest and the southwest regions, and creation of the National Commission for the Promotion of Bilingualism and Multiculturalism. More measures need to continue this path of empowering all Cameroonians to raise their voices and participate meaningfully in policy, particularly in communities that feel their cultural rights are not upheld. In Peru, I am concerned by the opening of a parliamentary inquiry on all members of the National Justice Board, an independent institution in charge of appointing judges and prosecutors. The investigation could impact judicial independence and the separation of powers. Since January, my office has documented 13 bills and 5 constitutional accusations by Congress that have raised concerns regarding interference into autonomous constitutional bodies, particularly the National Election Board and the National Justice Board. I call on Congress to abide by the UN basic principles on the independence of the judiciary and respect the balance of state powers. Mr. President, more than halfway through the 2030 agenda, we are on target for it to become a tragic monument to the failure of our generation to erase extreme poverty and realize human rights. At the SDG summit next week, at COP28 on climate change, and at the Summit of the Future in 2024, states need to pivot decisively towards fundamental changes. And as we approach our Human Rights 75 high-level event in December, I urge all member states to make genuine commitments through transformative pledges. The Declaration on the Right to Development sets out rights and duties on the part of states to forge development and related policies for the well-being of all. Operationalizing this right is essential, and the draft International Covenant on the Right to Development has been submitted to the Council at this session for further action. In conclusion, let me stress again that the human rights cause in all its facets has the potential to unify us at a time when we urgently need to come together to confront the existential challenges that we face. This is ultimately about building trust and restoring hope through the work of this Council, and all of us need to play our part. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. High Commissioner. Colleagues, we will now take a short break before beginning the interactive dialogue on the report of the independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar. So I'm announcing 1 minute break. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, we will now begin the interactive dialogue on the report of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, as mandated in Council Resolution 39/2. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes, and I have the pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Nicholas Kumjan, head of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, for his presentation. And I thank you very much for taking your seats and listening. Thank you. Sir, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, it is an honor to appear before you to present the 5th annual report of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar. Last year, I reported to this Council an increase in serious international crimes committed in the country. Tragically, the frequency and intensity of war crimes and crimes against humanity has only increased in recent months. In the past year, we have seen more brazen aerial bombings and indiscriminate shelling, resulting in the deaths of innocent civilians, including children. We have also seen increased executions of captured combatants and civilians, and intentional burnings of homes and villages. There has also been a rise in the number of arrests without due process, and we have collected credible evidence that some detainees have been subjected to torture, sexual violence, and other severe mistreatments. The ongoing violence has forced our mechanism to expand its inquiries to many parts of the country, but we retain our commitment and focus on collecting and analyzing evidence of the campaign against the Rohingya population during the 2016 and 2017 clearance operations. We have collected compelling evidence of the widespread burning of Rohingya villages and assaults and killing of civilians. I have been particularly horrified by the numerous accounts of sexual crimes that we have collected. Mr. President, the quantity of evidence and information we have been able to collect in the past year from individuals and organizations is unprecedented and, frankly, unanticipated. With this increased workload and our limited resources, we have had to strategically focus our investigations on the gravest crimes, where the impact on victims has been the most severe. We continue to face the challenge of not having access to Myanmar. Our repeated requests for information and access to crime scenes have been ignored by the Myanmar authorities. We also face challenges in conducting investigative activities in other countries where witnesses and information providers are located. To compensate, we have embraced innovative technology to propel our investigations. Our open source team uses cutting-edge technology to analyze and verify large quantities of material, such as videos, photographs, and other information posted on social media. We are also using geospatial imagery to determine damage to villages before and after attacks. This type of evidence is then cross-checked against the information received from at least 700 sources, including more than 200 eyewitness accounts. We have also begun a dedicated inquiry into financial information related to entities and individuals that have contributed to or benefited from the serious international crimes committed in Myanmar. We are looking at weapons supply chains and the dispossession of land, homes, and businesses, particularly during the clearance operations in Rakhine State. Mr. President, we understand this Council did not create our mechanism to simply place evidence in storage. Rather, our intent is to use the evidence to facilitate justice and accountability in courts and tribunals willing and able to prosecute these cases. We are currently sharing information and evidence with 3 ongoing proceedings focused on crimes against the Rohingya at the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and in courts in Argentina. We are now finalizing 3 analytical reports to share with these authorities concerning the military chain of command in Rakhine State, the failure of Myanmar authorities to investigate or punish sexual and gender-based crimes, and the ongoing spread, the organized spread of hate speech content on social media by the Myanmar military during the 2017 clearance operations. I am particularly grateful to the brave survivors of these crimes who have shared their testimonies. None of our work would be possible without the courage and commitment of the many individuals and organizations that provide us with information. We are using the most advanced technologies to ensure that the interactions they have with us have the highest level of security and confidentiality. I'm also grateful for the support of this Council and call on all member states committed to ending the violence in Myanmar to support our work and give us the access we need to witnesses and information on their territories. Mr. President, the Myanmar people are suffering deeply from the effects of these ongoing horrific crimes. I would like them to know that the mechanism is committed to pursuing justice for them, and we are focusing our efforts to ensure that the perpetrators will one day be held to account. Thank you.
Thank you. Now let me invite the interested delegations to ask questions to Mr. Kumjan and to make comments on the report. So let me open the floor for you. Let me remind you also that the speaking time limit is 1 minute and 30 seconds for members and observers. First on my list is Finland, speaking on behalf of a group of countries. Finland, you have the floor.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic Baltic countries. Our deepest condolences to the victims and families of the earthquake in Morocco. We fully support the work of the IIMM. We welcome its increased cooperation with civil society and initiatives regarding the well-being of both witnesses and staff members. Furthermore, we welcome the financial investigations on issues that have had a direct impact on victim communities. The report tells of sexual and gender-based violence, torture, extrajudicial killings, enlisting children, burning and destroying civilian objects and other crimes, some of which may amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. We fully condemn all human rights violations and abuses in Myanmar and call for an immediate end to brutal attacks on civilians, including the Rohingya. Despite lack of cooperation from the junta, first-hand testimonials in the IIMM repository have increased. We will not turn our back on the brave survivors and witnesses, but keep on calling for accountability. We urge the junta to fully cooperate with the IIMM, respect human rights and uphold the rule of law and fully implement the ASEAN's 5-point consensus. I thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is the European Union.
The EU thanks the head of the IIMM for the annual report and update. We strongly support the mandate. The European Union condemns the military coup and is alarmed at the number of incidents bearing the marks of international crime has increased. You describe the brazenness of the Myanmar military, stressing the indiscriminate or disproportionate bombings of civilians and their homes, the murders of civilians detained during operations, and the mass executions and displacement of civilians or fighters hors de combat. Your report sets out the organised command structure of the Myanmar military and how it may have deliberately prepared and executed international crimes, including sexual and gender-based violence. Your work greatly contribute to accountability efforts. The EU calls on the Myanmar armed forces to immediately halt the use of violence against civilians, create the conditions for a safe and dignified return of Rohingya to Myanmar, facilitate the unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid, adopt a moratorium on the death penalty, release political detainees, and allow the population to exercise their rights, including their freedom of expression and assembly. Chair, how have the civil society dialogues most contributed to your work? Thank you.
I thank you. And now let me invite Pakistan, speaking on behalf of the OIC.
Mr. President, we convey our deepest condolences to the government and people of Morocco over the lives lost as a result of the earthquake and stand in solidarity with them in this difficult time. The OIC welcomes the report and update of the independent mechanism and commends the progress being made by it. It is important for the mechanism to continue collecting, consolidating, preserving, and analyzing evidence of the most serious violations of international law committed in Myanmar since 2011 in a manner that no perpetrator of crimes against the Rohingya remains unidentified. The OIC calls upon the mechanism to also continue its close and timely cooperation with the judicial forums, including the International Court of Justice. We thank Bangladesh and other host countries for their continued support to the mechanism, including facilitating its visits to the region. The OIC deeply regrets Myanmar's persistent non-cooperation with the mechanism, including its indifference to the requests for country visits. We call on Myanmar to fully cooperate with the mechanism and not to destroy any evidence. We hope the mechanism will continue to strengthen its capacities to overcome constraints, including through the use of innovative technologies that may enable the analysis of information and evidence more efficiently and effectively. The OIC calls on OHCHR to continue providing appropriate support to the mechanism to pursue its mandate effectively. I thank you.
Thank you. Next on my list is Liechtenstein.
Thank you, Mr. President. Liechtenstein thanks the head of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, Mr. Kumjian, for the presentation of the report. The report reveals that the situation in Myanmar continues to be tragic. The population has to suffer from ongoing fighting, resulting in numerous human rights violations. There's also strong evidence that serious international crimes, including the war crimes of indiscriminate targeting of civilians, the intentional killing of civilians and combatants who are detained, as well as a large-scale destruction of civilian dwellings and other civilian buildings have been and continue to be committed against the people of Myanmar. One of the only glimmers of hope in this worrying situation emanates from the IIMM, which does invaluable work in the collection, preservation, and analysis of international crimes committed in Myanmar. The information provided for ongoing court cases is an important cornerstone for justice for the people of Myanmar, in particular the Rohingya Muslims. We reiterate our full support to the IIMM and encourage states to support the mechanism, particularly to overcome the challenges outlined in the report. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. And now I'm inviting Egypt.
السيد الرئيس، يود وفد مصر بداية أن يتقدم بخالص التعازي إلى الأشقاء في المغرب الشقيق، متمنيا دوام الصحة والعافية للمصابين وأن يذهبوا، ولكافة العائلات بدوام الصحة. السيد الرئيس، تأخذ مصر علما بتقرير الآلية المستقلة لجمع الأدلة المتعلقة بالجرائم الدولية الجسيمة وانتهاكات القانون الدولي في ميانمار منذ عام 2011، كما تؤكد إدانتها الكاملة لجميع انتهاكات ضد أقلية الروهينجا وتعرب عن أسفها إزاء استمرار وضعهم المأساوي، وتطالب حكومة ميانمار بوضع حد لتلك الانتهاكات من خلال اتخاذ الإجراءات الكفيلة بتوفير الحماية اللازمة لهم وإيجاد حل دائم للأزمة. وتدعم مصر في هذا الصدد جميع الجهود الدولية والإقليمية الرامية لتفعيل المحاسبة، وتدعو مكتب المفوض السامي للتواصل والتعاون مع منظمة التعاون الإسلامي أخذا في الاعتبار محورية دور المنظمة في تلك القضية. كما تسمن مصر في هذا الإطار دور بنغلاديش وجهودها المستمرة لمواجهة تداعيات أزمة الروهينجا، وتدعو المجتمع الدولي لتقديم الدعم اللازم للدول المستضيفة لهم والنظر في حلول عملية ومستدامة لمشكلة اللاجئين. شكرا سيدي الرئيس.
Thank you. And now let me pass the floor to Luxembourg.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Ma délégation exprime ses profondes condoléances et solidarité au peuple et au gouvernement du Maroc. Le Luxembourg s'associe pleinement à la déclaration faite par l'Union européenne. Nous tenons à remercier M. Kumjian et toute son équipe du mécanisme d'enquête indépendant pour leur travail indispensable. La documentation et le traitement des données sont un prérequis pour établir la responsabilité que la junte devra assumer par rapport aux crimes de guerre et aux crimes contre l'humanité qu'elle continue de perpétrer au Myanmar en toute impunité. Le mécanisme œuvre sans relâche au renforcement de ses capacités afin de répondre aux défis de rassembler et de traiter un nombre impressionnant d'éléments, d'informations et de preuves. Sans accès direct au territoire, confronté à une complexité linguistique particulière et dans le souci permanent de protéger les témoins. Le Luxembourg réitère son appel aux autorités de fait du Myanmar d'arrêter immédiatement les violences contre la population civile, de relâcher tous les prisonniers politiques et de permettre un accès sans entrave à l'aide humanitaire. Nous exhortons aussi tous les autres pays, en particulier de l'ASEAN, à collaborer avec le mécanisme afin de leur faciliter la tâche et de protéger victimes et témoins. Monsieur Koumjian, comment pouvons-nous faciliter votre plan sur le travail technologique, votre travail sur le plan technologique, au niveau du traitement des données et en vue de sécuriser davantage vos opérations? Ensuite, de quel autre type de soutien, d'ordre légal ou autre, avez-vous besoin de la part des États? Je vous remercie.
Merci à vous. Now let me indicate that the list of speakers is closed and the next speaker is Costa Rica.
Gracias, presidente. Costa Rica agradece al mecanismo por su trabajo que ha sido realizado en condiciones difíciles y peligrosas, no solo para sus miembros, sino también para los testigos y víctimas. Desafortunadamente, nuevamente debemos alzar la voz para denunciar el deterioro de la situación de derechos humanos en Myanmar y las atroces condiciones que vive su población, en especial las minorías, mujeres y personas con discapacidad. La Junta Militar no ha mostrado interés en investigar y castigar las severas violaciones de derechos humanos y los potenciales crímenes de guerra cometidos en el país. Por esta razón, renovamos nuestro compromiso por las víctimas e insistimos en la lucha contra la impunidad de estos crímenes debe ser un asunto prioritario para la comunidad internacional. El trabajo del mecanismo es esencial en este sentido. La evidencia recabada debe ser protegida para eventualmente ser utilizada por los entes jurisdiccionales adecuados. En este sentido, quisiéramos consultar qué acciones debemos tomar para coadyuvar en los esfuerzos investigativos y que la evidencia recabada cumpla su propósito de llevar a la justicia a los responsables y dar un remedio efectivo a las víctimas. Antes de terminar, permítame expresar nuestras más sentidas condolencias con el gobierno y el pueblo de Marruecos. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Belgium, you have the floor.
Monsieur le Président, la Belgique s'associe à la déclaration de l'Union européenne et remercie le mécanisme d'enquête indépendant pour son rapport. Notre pays reste profondément affecté par le sort de la population au Myanmar, confrontée à la violence, au conflit armé, à une crise humanitaire, économique et des droits humains d'une ampleur considérable. Votre rapport confirme une multiplication de possibles crimes internationaux graves depuis le coup d'État militaire de février 2021 et en particulier durant cette dernière année, ce qui rend votre travail d'autant plus essentiel. Les crimes sexuels et de genre et les violations graves dont les enfants sont victimes continuent d'être perpétrés en toute impunité par des membres des forces de sécurité et de groupes armés. La situation déplorable des Rohingyas déplacés depuis 5 ans reste tout aussi inacceptable. À cet égard, la Belgique salue votre étroite collaboration avec la Cour internationale de justice, la Cour pénale internationale et les tribunaux nationaux exerçant la compétence universelle sur ces questions, de même que l'intensification des dialogues que vous menez avec la société civile. Monsieur Koumjian, afin de rendre justice à la population du Myanmar et de prévenir ces violences, de quelle manière la communauté internationale peut-elle soutenir davantage votre collaboration avec la société civile dont le rôle nous semble indispensable? Je vous remercie.
Merci à vous. Kingdom of the Netherlands, please.
Thank you, Mr. President, and allow me to first use the opportunity to convey our heartfelt condolences to the victims of the earthquake in Morocco. Mr. President, the Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement just given. We thank the IIMM for its continued hard work, which remains crucial in supporting accountability efforts at the national, regional and international level. We are deeply worried by the accounts in the report of intensified armed conflicts and of more evidence strongly indicating that serious international crimes are being committed against the people in Myanmar. It is vital that perpetrators of human rights violations, including sexual and gender-based violence, are held accountable and are brought to justice. Accountability must be part of the solution for Myanmar. The sharing of collected evidence with authorities such as the ICC, the Attorney General's Office in Argentina, and the ICJ greatly contribute to such accountability efforts. Mr. Koumjian, my question to you is, sir, what actions can the international community take to further support the work of the IIMN in ensuring accountability on the basis of your findings? Thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite France.
Merci Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le chef du mécanisme, la France remercie le mécanisme pour son 5e rapport qui documente précisément la dégradation de la situation des droits de l'homme en Birmanie, note l'intensification des conflits armés et regrette le manque flagrant de progrès dans la mise en œuvre des recommandations du mécanisme. La France appelle l'ensemble des parties prenantes à coopérer avec le mécanisme d'enquête et à lui garantir l'accès sans entrave au terrain et aux victimes, notamment dans le cadre du dialogue avec la société civile. La France rappelle sa condamnation dans les termes les plus fermes du coup d'État perpétré par la junte militaire le 1er février 2021 et des nombreuses violations des droits de l'homme qui s'en sont suivies, dont les forces armées de sécurité portent la responsabilité. Elle appelle la junte à cesser les violences à l'encontre de sa propre population et à respecter le droit international humanitaire, notamment en garantissant un accès humanitaire complet, sûr et sans entrave. Elle réitère son appel à la libération immédiate et inconditionnelle de l'ensemble des personnes arbitrairement détenues, dont la conseillère pour l'État Aung San Suu Kyi. Elle réitère la condamnation de la politique de la junte à l'égard de groupes entiers, à commencer par les Rohingyas. Monsieur le chef du mécanisme, comment le mécanisme d'enquête évalue-t-il sa coopération avec les différentes juridictions pour lutter contre l'impunité et assurer réparation aux victimes? Je vous remercie.
Merci à vous. United States of America, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for your report, Mr. Kumjan. On behalf of the United States, I want to reiterate our gratitude for the necessary and difficult work of the IIMM. We are alarmed by your report of a dramatic increase in war crimes and crimes against humanity in the country, with widespread and systematic attacks against civilians. Such acts are utterly unacceptable and must be stopped. The Myanmar authorities' refusal to cooperate with your investigations remains a shameful impediment to justice. All member states, including Myanmar and its neighbors, must cooperate with and allow access to the IIMM to carry out its mandated activities. We applaud the members of civil society who work tirelessly to defend the human rights of the people of Myanmar, despite the risks they face to their freedom, well-being, and even their lives. We also thank the brave witnesses who provided evidence to the IIMM, in some cases reliving horrific traumas while living in fear of reprisal or deportation. The Myanmar military's continued atrocities and its abuses and violations underscore the need for and importance of the IIMM in promoting accountability and justice and deterring further atrocities. What actions can the international community take to provide stronger protections for witnesses, particularly those without legal immigration status? I thank you.
Japan, you have the floor.
Mr. Chair and Mr. Kamjian for your briefing. First of all, Japan expresses its solidarity and heartfelt condolence on the casualty and their families caused by the earthquake in Morocco. On Myanmar, Japan expresses strong concern about the continued lack of actions to improve the situation where the use of violence is causing a large number of casualties, despite repeated calls for restraint by the international community. Japan urges all stakeholders to make efforts to refrain from violence and find a peaceful solution in order to restore peace and stability in Myanmar. Japan will continue to support the effort of ASEAN to improve the situation in Myanmar. Japan once again strongly urges Myanmar military to work together towards the peaceful solution of the situation by taking concrete actions to immediately stop the violence, release those detained, and swiftly restore Myanmar democratic political system and implement ASEAN's 5-point consensus. Japan will continue to monitor the humanitarian rights and the humanitarian situation in Myanmar and call for respect for the will of its people. I thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président, nos pensées sont avec les Marocaines et les Marocains touchés par le terrible tremblement de terre. La Suisse est solidaire avec le Maroc. Monsieur le Président, la Suisse remercie le mécanisme d'enquête indépendant pour le Myanmar pour la présentation de son rapport. Le mécanisme a été créé pour préserver et analyser les éléments de preuve sur les crimes internationaux et les violations du droit international commis au Myanmar depuis 2011 et de faciliter des procédures pénales. Ces travaux sont plus pertinents et nécessaires que jamais. Il a également dû répondre à la crise que le Myanmar vit depuis la prise de pouvoir par les autorités militaires. Les responsables de ces crimes, y inclus contre les Rohingyas, doivent répondre de leurs actes. Nous soulignons la nécessité de mener des investigations crédibles, transparentes, indépendantes et impartiales sur toutes les violations de droit international et de traduire leurs auteurs présumés en justice. La Suisse encourage toutes les parties au conflit à coopérer avec les mécanismes internationaux et à s'engager dans un dialogue pour la recherche d'une solution politique à cette grave crise multidimensionnelle. La Suisse exhorte les autorités militaires du Myanmar à pleinement et rapidement mettre en œuvre la résolution 2669 du Conseil de sécurité. La population civile est fortement affectée par la violente crise politique et les conflits qui secouent le pays. Nous appelons au respect du droit international et à ce que l'accès humanitaire rapide et sans encombre soit garanti. Monsieur Koumjian, la Suisse va continuer à soutenir le mécanisme. De quel soutien supplémentaire celui-ci a-t-il besoin pour faire avancer son mandat?
Merci beaucoup. Turkey, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Turkey remains concerned by the worsening security and humanitarian situation in Myanmar. The crisis in Myanmar continues to have severe repercussions on the most vulnerable groups, particularly the Muslim Rohingya community. The findings of the last IIMM report show that the widespread and systematic violations continue against the Rohingya people. We call on the international community to take immediate steps to hold those responsible for these atrocities accountable. As last month marked the 6th anniversary of the Rohingya crisis, it is of utmost importance that the international community to increase its humanitarian assistance to the Rohingya refugees and alleviate the burden on Bangladesh. Mr. President, we have been involved in many humanitarian activities in various fields in both Myanmar and Bangladesh. The Turkish field hospital in Cox's Bazar has been provided essential health services to more than 1,000 people per day since 2018. Turkey will continue with its relief efforts covering infrastructure, housing, education, agriculture, child services, capacity building and income generating projects. Turkey will also continue to work with the international community to find a pathway for the voluntary, safe and dignified return of the Rohingya and other communities to their homes. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I'm inviting Malta.
Thank you, President. First, I extend Malta's deepest condolences to the government and people of Morocco following the weekend earthquake. Malta aligns itself with the statement of the European Union and thanks the IIMM for its report. We commend the mechanism for its unwavering commitment to uncover the evidence and ensure accountability for the grave human rights violations in Myanmar. Malta expresses deep concern over the continued reports of gross human rights abuses, including those amounting to crimes against humanity, committed against the Rohingya and other minority communities. We call upon the government of Myanmar to cooperate fully with the mechanism, to allow unhindered access to investigate allegations and to hold perpetrators accountable. Moreover, we emphasize the need to ensuring a safe and dignified environment for the voluntary return of displaced persons in compliance with international standards. Malta remains committed to supporting initiatives that seek justice, accountability and reconciliation in Myanmar. It is vital that the perpetrators of these atrocities face justice and that steps are taken to prevent a recurrence. We urge the international community to stand united, sending a clear message that human rights violations will not be tolerated and ultimately that justice will prevail. I thank you.
Thank you. And now we will continue with a video statement by United Nations Children's Fund.
President, UNICEF welcomes the report of the Independent Investigative Mechanism, which makes for sobering reading. UNICEF recognizes the increasingly challenging environment in which the mechanism operates. UNICEF is on the ground in Myanmar, and we see that children are bearing the brunt of the crisis. Grave child rights violations verified by the UN continue to rise. UNICEF welcomes the mechanism's commitment to investigating sexual and gender-based crimes and crimes against children as a high priority. Constraints on access and delivery of services across the country continue to have a devastating impact for children and families. Schools and health facilities remain under attack, further devastating children's lives. Further, Myanmar is contaminated with landmines and unexploded ordnance. In the first 6 months of 2023, 556 casualties were reported nationwide due to landmines and explosive remnants of war. This is 143% of the total casualties reported last year. Children make up 20% of these casualties. UNICEF urges all parties to the conflict to comply with international humanitarian and human rights law, to end grave child rights violations, to allow unconditional and sustained humanitarian access, and to take all necessary measures to prevent and stop all forms of violence against children. We stand ready to support. Thank you.
Delegation of China has the floor.
主席先生，中国代表团首先对摩洛哥地震遇难者表达哀悼。主席先生，中国代表团对缅甸作为当事国未能参加此次互动对话表示遗憾。中方一贯主张各方通过建设性的对话与合作解决人权领域的分歧，反对将人权问题政治化，反对公开施压的做法。人权理事会有关讨论应当有助于缅甸实现稳定和发展，而不是相反。缅甸问题非常复杂，内外因素错乱交织，历史和现实一再证明，把主权平等、不干涉内政等国际关系基本准则抛诸脑后，动辄施压，解决不了问题，反而会激化矛盾，加剧局势动荡，甚至影响地区稳定。中方呼吁国际社会从缅人民利益出发，为缓和缅局势发挥建设性的作用。中方支持缅孟双方妥善协商处置莫开邦问题，已经并将继续提供力所能及的帮助，助力缅孟早日启动首批遣返。谢谢主席。
Thank you. Malawi, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow my delegation to extend condolences to the Kingdom of Morocco for the tragic loss of lives due to an earthquake 3 days ago. Malawi thanks the independent investigative mechanism for this report. We note with concern the serious human rights violations in Myanmar as detailed in the report. These include the failure by Myanmar to investigate or punish sexual and gender-based crimes, and the organized spread of hate speech, attacks on the civilians, among others. We urge the military in Myanmar to take effective steps to ensure accountability for serious crimes committed with effective remedies for victims of human rights violations and ultimately return to civilian rule. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. And now let me invite Canada.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Nos profondes condoléances et notre solidarité sont avec le peuple marocain. Monsieur le Président, le Canada salue le mécanisme pour les progrès accomplis, pour le renforcement du dialogue avec un éventail d'intervenants et pour son rapport indiquant qu'il existe des preuves solides d'une augmentation substantielle des crimes de guerre et des crimes contre l'humanité au Myanmar, ce qui rappelle la nécessité d'unir nos efforts pour mettre fin à la vente d'armes au régime au Myanmar. Le Canada est gravement préoccupé par l'augmentation de la violence, tels que les bombardements aériens aveugles, les massacres de civils, les rapports indiquant l'utilisation d'armes à sous-munitions, les violences sexuelles et sexistes, ainsi que les incendies de bâtiments civils et de villages entiers. Le Canada continue de travailler avec les Nations Unies et la communauté internationale pour faire en sorte que les auteurs de violations graves des droits de la personne et des droits internationaux humanitaires rendent des comptes et pour obtenir justice pour les survivants, y compris les Rohingyas. Nous invitons également tous les États membres à collaborer pleinement et significativement. Nous réitérons notre soutien au mécanisme et notre intention d'intervenir dans l'affaire du génocide des Rohingyas intenté par la Gambie contre le Myanmar devant la Cour internationale de justice. Monsieur Koumjian, comment la communauté internationale peut-elle mieux soutenir le mécanisme dans la collecte de preuves pertinentes concernant les odieux crimes sexuels et sexistes commis par le régime, y compris...
Now let me invite Malaysia.
President, my delegation extends our condolences to Morocco and stands in solidarity with the Moroccan people during this difficult time. Mr. President, Malaysia aligns itself with the statement of the OIC, and we thank the IMM for the report. It is regrettable that the situation in Myanmar has shown no sign of abating since the military coup in 2021. We remain deeply concerned with the findings of the latest report that indicates crimes against humanity have likely been committed. Accountability for mass atrocities is crucial towards finding a just and durable solution to the Rakhine crisis. It is also a key step towards achieving reconciliation and restoring long-term peace and stability in Myanmar. Preventing the recurrence of atrocities and ensuring the fundamental rights of the victims are essential in realizing Myanmar people's aspirations for a peaceful, prosperous, and democratic Myanmar. Malaysia remains committed to facilitate IMM in fulfilling its mandate to bring justice for victims. Malaysia welcomes IMM's continuous engagement with stakeholders, including pursuance of the first dialogue between the IMM and civil society organizations. Mr. Komjian, could you share the procedures that the IMM have in place to confirm the veracity of the information transmitted to your team? Thank you.
Thank you. And let me invite Indonesia.
Mr. President, Indonesia remains deeply concerned with this continued escalation of violence in Myanmar. It is very disheartening to see that the people suffering and humanitarian crisis in Myanmar show no sign of abating. During our chairmanship in ASEAN, Indonesia has made every effort to ensure concrete progress on the implementation of the 5-point consensus, including facilitating the visit of SR Myanmar to Indonesia. As a result, earlier this year, ASEAN through the AHA Center had successfully delivered 3 batches of humanitarian assistance to different states in Myanmar and will continue to do so. We appreciate the continued support from the external partners and international community for the 5PC implementation. In the summit last week, ASEAN leaders have adopted a review and decision on the implementation of 5PC, which decided that 5PC remains to be ASEAN's main reference in addressing Myanmar's political crisis that should be implemented in its entirety. We firmly believe that a sustainable ASEAN's ongoing approach to Myanmar is critical to promote cessation of violence, further facilitate humanitarian assistance, and establish inclusive national dialogue. Mr. Head of Mechanism, how can you ensure that your works would prompt positive trajectory to the political crisis and human rights situation in Myanmar? Thank you.
Thank you. And now I'm inviting Romania.
Mr. President, Romania aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. My country welcomes the report of the independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar. It presents thoroughly the increasing violence and crimes against civilians and the human rights abuses, including those against the Rohingya minority. We appreciate the mechanism's capacity to collect and assess relevant information in a challenging context marked by no physical access to crime sites or witnesses inside Myanmar and the lack of cooperation by the authorities in Naypyidaw. Romania deplores the continuous and expanding violation of human rights in Myanmar, particularly the attacks against civilians, sexual and gender-based crimes and crimes against children, including the military enlisting of children under the age of 15, and the atrocities against the Rohingya community. Romania continues to fully support the work of the mechanism aimed at ensuring the accountability of perpetrators and justice for victims of the most serious international crimes and violations of international law committed in Myanmar since 2011. In the absence of a notable progress as regards the fight against violence and crimes against civilians and the human rights abuses, including against the Rohingya, what steps could take the international community to pressure and to hold accountable the Myanmar authorities? Thank you.
Thank you. Russian Federation is the next.
Господин председатель, поиск конструктивных путей международного содействия урегулированию ситуации в Мьянме, в том числе ее гуманитарных и правочеловеческих аспектов, призван играть вспомогательную роль по отношению к усилиям самих мьянманцев по нормализации обстановки в стране. Необходимо, чтобы все политические силы Мьянмы проявляли сдержанность и избегали шагов, ведущих к эскалации насилия, поляризации общественных настроений. Важной предпосылкой для общенационального примирения служит режим прекращения огня, введенный в одностороннем порядке мьянманскими властями. Объявленная в августе амнистия лиц, привлеченных к ответственности за участие в несанкционированных акциях протеста, вносит вклад в восстановление общественного мира и согласия. Опасной является линия так называемого правительства национального единства на продолжение вооруженного сопротивления, которое приводит к дезорганизации общественной жизни и социально-экономического положения, убийствам сотрудников органов власти и простых граждан, лояльно настроенных к властям. Негативно расцениваем стремление отдельных стран использовать многосторонние площадки, прежде всего СПЧ, для политизации вопроса о правозащитной ситуации в Мьянме и придания ее обсуждению конфронтационного характера. Подобная политика лишь увеличивает противоречия и подрывает усилия по поиску конструктивных форм международного содействия этой стране. Благодарю за внимание.
Спасибо. South Africa.
Mr. President, South Africa wishes to express its appreciation to the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar for its report and for the notable progress it has made in monitoring and investigating the deteriorating human rights situation in the country. We particularly commend the mechanism for continuing to prioritize the collection of information on sexual and gender-based crimes, which disturbingly have been committed with the highest levels of cruelty and harm to the victims. This information accords with the mechanism's broader findings, which point to a dramatic increase in the perpetration of war crimes and crimes against humanity, with widespread and systematic attacks against civilians and civilian objects by the Myanmar military and its affiliate militias. South Africa is deeply concerned about these findings. We echo the mechanism in saluting those brave individuals who share information, often at significant risk. Accordingly, we are pleased that the mechanism was recently able to host its first civil society dialogue to hear from and support those collecting this information on the front line. As we solemnly mark the 6th anniversary since the Rohingya were forced to flee their homes, South Africa therefore appeals to all member states to cooperate with the mechanism in facilitating the necessary accountability and justice for this horrific assault against humanity, and in so doing stand in solidarity with the people of Myanmar who deserve no less. I thank you.
Thank you. Bangladesh is the next.
Thank you, Mr. President. Bangladesh welcomes the report of the Independent Investigative Mechanism on Myanmar. We commend IIMM for its continued work to collect and preserve evidence of crimes committed in Myanmar, including against the Rohingya, as well as to prepare files for the future cases before criminal courts. We appreciate mechanisms' close engagement with the ICJ, ICC, and the court in Argentina to facilitate justice for the Rohingyas. We are pleased to host IIM's successive missions to Bangladesh and committed to cooperate further with the mechanism. Mechanism's access to Myanmar is important for the on-the-ground investigations. We urge Myanmar to fully cooperate with IIMM. Ensuring justice and accountability is important for the Rohingyas sheltered in Bangladesh to have the confidence to return to Myanmar. Therefore, we urge all relevant member states and other entities to assist IIMM to realize its mandate. While retributive justice and accountability are important for the Rohingya, a sustainable return to their homeland with rights must be the ultimate objective of the process of seeking justice. International community should lay equal focus on restorative justice, truth-seeking, reconciliation, and creation of more supportive atmosphere in Rakhine for voluntary return of the Rohingyas. As I conclude, I express our heartfelt condolences to the people of Morocco. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Australia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and Australia too expresses sincere condolences to the people of Morocco. We thank the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar for its 5th report to the Council. Australia reiterates its support for the mechanism and the important work under its mandate to collect, consolidate, preserve and analyse evidence of the most serious international crimes and violations of international law committed in Myanmar. We strongly condemn the military regime's increasing use of violence against civilians detailed in the report, including bombings, killing of detainees, crimes against children and the large-scale and intentional burnings of civilian dwellings. We note with grave concern the report's findings that the regime knew or should have known that civilians were present at the time of aerial bombings that resulted in large numbers of civilian casualties. Australia calls on all states, especially those in the Indo-Pacific region, to facilitate the mechanism's critical investigations, including through supporting evidence collection and interviews in their territories. We also reiterate Council Resolution 5231's call on UN entities to share evidence with the mechanism and to support future prosecutions. Australia asks, how can states best support the mechanism's investigative efforts given access continues to be denied to Myanmar by the regime? Thank you.
Thank you. United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, please.
The UK would like to express its deepest condolences to the people of Morocco at this time. The UK is grateful for the mechanism's continued work to facilitate justice and accountability in Myanmar. Its latest report brings to light the scale of Myanmar's military's brutal tactics. The reporting of military's brutal actions against the people of Myanmar, including indiscriminate targeting and killing of civilians through airstrikes and the large-scale burning of homes, is truly alarming. Accountability is the only way to end the culture of impunity in Myanmar, and the UK is committed to supporting this goal, providing $500,000 to the IIMM, establishing the Myanmar Witness Programme, and leading efforts to secure the first ever UN Security Council resolution on the situation in Myanmar, urging all parties to respect human rights and end violence. To successfully collect evidence and continue to meet its mandate, the mechanism relies on the cooperation of all UN and international partners. Without the cooperation of all UN entities, the mechanism would not be able to undertake vital activities to hold the Myanmar military to account. What more can Member States do to facilitate the mechanism's collection of evidence and witness statements? Thank you.
Thank you. Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, please.
Gracias, presidente. Expresamos nuestras condolencias y solidaridad al pueblo marroquí en tan difíciles momentos. Son ya 4 años de la imposición de este mecanismo en Myanmar, con un nuevo, cuestionable y desbalanceado informe presentado sin que se permita escuchar al país concernido. Los mandatos políticamente motivados como este nunca propiciarán el clima necesario para el diálogo genuino y la cooperación en la protección de los derechos humanos, pilares fundamentales de la labor de este Consejo. Señor presidente, seguiremos alentando a Myanmar a continuar con los esfuerzos en favor de la paz duradera necesaria para la estabilidad del país y el desarrollo sostenible de su pueblo, además del abordaje de la delicada situación de los Rohingya y en el estado de Rakhine dentro del marco de las garantías de los derechos humanos. El EPU es el mecanismo idóneo para abordar la situación de los derechos humanos en el mundo en pie de igualdad y no la imposición de hostiles mandatos selectivos e ineficaces prácticas que debe desterrarse de nuestras labores. Estamos convencidos de que el diálogo político es la única vía para solucionar las diferencias en el país y que sea el pueblo de Myanmar en su capacidad soberana, sin injerencia y con el apoyo de la comunidad de naciones amantes de la paz, quien logre superar sus desafíos. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Mauritania, you have the floor.
شكرا سيدي الرئيس. تعازينا للمغرب الشقيق، مصابكم مصابنا، رحم الله الموتى وشفى الجرحى. شكرا سيد الرئيس. يأخذ وفدي علما بتقرير الآلية المستقلة لجميع الأدلة المتعلقة بالجرائم الدولية الخطيرة وانتهاكات القانون الدولي المرتكبة في ميانمار، ونعرب عن أسفنا البالغ لاستمرار أزمة الروهينجا الذين يعانون من الاضطهاد الممنهج طويل الأمد والتهميش والتمييز والفقر والأمر الذي يؤدي إلى انتهاكات خطيرة لحقوق الإنسان بما في ذلك العنف الجنسي والجنساني والتهجير الجماعي القسري والاستيلاء غير المشروع على الأراضي والحرمان من حقوق المواطنة والوثائق المدنية وفرض القيود على حرية التنقل والوصول إلى الخدمات الصحية والتعليمية والحصول على فرص كسب العيش الكريم. سيد الرئيس، يحث وفد سلطات ميانمار على إزالة جميع القيود التعسفية على الروهينجا بما في ذلك القيود المفروضة على حرية التنقل والصحة والتعليم وسبل العيش والمساواة في الحصول على الجنسية، كما يدعوها إلى البدء فورا في إعادة آمنة وكريمة للروهينجا النازحين قسرا. ختاما، يدعم وفدي جميع الجهود المبذولة على المستويين الإقليمي والدولي الهادفة إلى تفعيل محاسبة عادلة ومستقلة في ميانمار. كما ندعو المجتمع الدولي للسعي لتحقيق سلام دائم وبناء مجتمع على أسس مبادئ عدم التمييز وترسيخ المساواة واتخاذ الإجراءات الكفيلة بتوفير الحماية اللازمة للروهينجا.
Thank you. And now let me invite the delegation of Gambia. Gambia, you have the floor. Gambia, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Republic of the Gambia commends the IIMM for this enlightening report and wish to extend its deepest gratitude to the mechanism for the pivotal support it has offered the Gambia in the proceedings before the International Court of Justice against Myanmar. The materials shared by the mechanisms have been instrumental in shedding light on serious international crimes in Myanmar and have fortified our collective pursuit for justice and the rule of law. Mr. President, the comprehensive analytical report focused on the structures of the Myanmar military, the failure to address sexual and gender-based crimes, and the organized discrimination of hate speech and actions against the Rohingya have been invaluable to the Gambia's efforts at the ICJ. They provide not just a fundamental understanding of the systemic issues at hand, but also furnish concrete evidence that could be decisive in legal context. Mr. President, we are especially appreciative of the mechanism's efforts to collate testimonial evidence by undertaking several investigative missions to refugee camps and by conducting exhaustive interviews with witnesses, survivors, and defectors. In a time when the quest for justice seems increasingly difficult and elusive, the work of the IIMM serves as a beacon of hope. It sends a powerful message that impunity will not be tolerated and that those who commit heinous acts will be held
intervention. You have exhausted your speaking time limit, and I'm inviting Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you, Mr. President. We emphasize the critical need for a constructive and effective responses to the ongoing situation in Myanmar affecting the human rights of the Rohingya population. This issue demands attention of the Council while upholding the principles of national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-interference in the internal affairs of Myanmar. Regrettably, there has been no consensus on durable solutions for internally displaced Rohingyas, and no comprehensive plan for ensuring sustainable, dignified, and voluntary returns to Rakhine State has been developed. Indeed, a prerequisite for achieving a lasting solution is the swift normalization of the situation in Myanmar, the immediate removal of sanctions on this country, and the promotion of regional cooperation. We invite the authorities in Myanmar to consider the following measures to fulfill their primary responsibilities to promote, protect, and respect the human rights of its citizens. Demonstrate genuine political commitment to implementing the 5-point consensus reached by ASEAN in April 2021, facilitate access to civil and citizenship documentation for Rohingya communities, conduct a thorough investigation, and put an end to the unlawful disposition of the land from the Rohingya population. In conclusion, we express our gratitude to Bangladesh for hospitality towards displaced Rohingya individuals. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Bulgaria, you have the floor.
Mr. President, like previous speakers, let me express our deep condolences to and our solidarity with the people and the government of the Kingdom of Morocco. Regarding Myanmar, Bulgaria aligns with the EU statement. We're deeply concerned about the continuing human rights crisis and the overall humanitarian situation in Myanmar. Bulgaria is alarmed by the ongoing disregard of fundamental human rights, including arbitrary arrests and detentions, torture and ill treatment in custody, and the continuous number of convictions disregarding fair trial guarantees. We call on the military in Myanmar to cease all ethnic-based violence and release all political prisoners, to halt arbitrary detentions, torture, persecution and harassment of political opponents, public figures, human rights defenders and journalists. We reiterate our call for an inclusive dialogue between all stakeholders aimed at restoring democracy and the rule of law. Bulgaria welcomes ASEAN's efforts to improve the situation in the country and reiterates its support to the ASEAN 5-point consensus. We also commend the EU's continued engagement on Myanmar, including the efforts of the European Union's Special Envoy for Myanmar. UN special procedures, especially the independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar and humanitarian organizations, should be granted unhindered and unrestricted access to the territory of the country. Mr. Kumjan, what mechanisms could be put into place to counter the promulgation of hate speech against the Rohingya on social media, frequently initiated by segments of the Myanmar military? I thank you.
Thank you. And the last country on my list is Belarus.
Благодарю, господин председатель. Выражаем обеспокоенность продолжающейся политизации мандатов по Мьянме, включая независимый расследовательский механизм. Обращаем внимание на значительные ресурсы, которые затрачиваются в данном случае. Убеждены, что только добрая воля и заинтересованность государства в сотрудничестве может принести конкретную осязаемую помощь по улучшению ситуации на местах. В этом контексте приветствуем усилия мьянмарского правительства по сохранению взаимодействия с агентствами ООН, а также с государствами региона. Призываем уважать суверенитет Мьянмы, не допускать вмешательства во внутренние дела и отказаться от практики давления на суверенные страны с использованием дорогостоящих и малоэффективных страновых мандатов. В этой связи считаем важным для международных правозащитных механизмов придерживаться непредвзятой позиции, предпринимать усилия по расширению пространства для сотрудничества и восстановления доверия в диалоге с мьянмарскими властями. Благодарю за внимание.
Thank you. And we will continue with the list of NGOs speakers. And first on my list is Civicus, intervention by video.
We thank the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, IMM, for their recent report. The creation of IMM has been an important step by this Council to strengthen its effort for justice and accountability. The Burma Human Rights Network is a civil society organization working to document crime against Muslim minorities and others in Myanmar, while Civicus has been tracking attacks on civil rights, including the torture, sexual violence, and killings of politicians and human rights activists in detention. We welcome the engagement of IMM with the civil society and survivors. We recommend the IMM to ensure more regular and transparent communication and coordination with affected communities and civil society in Myanmar and Bangladesh through more dedicated IMM focal points who can speak Burmese and other ethnic languages. We also request the IMM to translate its updates into more ethnic languages. We encourage the IMM to continue to investigate crime against Muslims and other ethnic minorities throughout the country. We also urge the IMM to better support Myanmar human rights organizations on investigative standards, which will allow them to better support the mechanism mandate by submitting evidence collating according to the Indonesian standard. We encourage all UN member states to show their commitment to justice and accountability by increasing their support to civil society groups and activists documenting serious crime, continuing to fund the IMM and to support ongoing international justice mechanism. We thank you.
Now the intervention from the floor, Centre CCPR.
Mr. President, the Center for Civil and Political Rights welcomes the report of the mechanism and commends its work under highly challenging circumstances by utilizing advanced technologies and collaborating with various actors, including civil society organizations. We also welcome the progress made in enhancing the accountability on crimes committed against Rohingyas by sharing information with ICC, ICJ, and the Federal Prosecutor Office No. 9 in Argentina. We strongly believe that the work of the mechanism can contribute to achieve accountability for crimes committed since the illegal military coup in February 2021. The situation in Myanmar is deteriorating, violence intensifying, people suffering, while the Myanmar military continue to enjoy impunity and commit serious violation of international human rights and humanitarian law. Results of the analysis and investigation of the mechanism, if can be published in addition to the reporting on its activities, will strengthen the international response to the crisis, not only to ensure accountability, but also to more comprehensively address human rights violations on the ground, including provision of targeted assistance to vulnerable groups and effective remedies to victims. Mr. Kunjan, which bodies can and should play a role, based on the information the mechanism can provide, to enhance the accountability process, especially concerning the crimes committed since the illegal coup? What should the Council do to effectively build on the work of the mechanism to seek solutions to the crisis and protect the right of people in Myanmar? I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, and we will continue with another video statement now by Southeast Asia Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity and
Your
Expression
Excellency,
Caucus.
The statement is issued jointly with LGBTQ organizations from Myanmar. We welcome the report of the IIMM as it sheds light on the sexual and gender-based violence faced by the transgender Rohingya community. However, there is lack of data on sexual abuse targeting the LGBTQ community in Myanmar, both who are still inside the country and those who fled for safer places. One reported case involved an exiled Myanmar LGBTQ activist who was arrested and severely raped by 5 police authorities in Thailand. Myanmar LGBTQ organizations reported 12 cases of deaths, 74 arrests, and thousands fled to nearby countries. The junta's deliberate actions to identify and arrest LGBTQ individuals were motivated by the perception of a connection between LGBTQ rights and the democratic agenda. LGBTQ activists in custody have faced sexual violence, including harassment, genital harm, and rape by military personnel. We urge the Council to improve the mechanism's engagement with Myanmar LGBTQ human rights defenders. UN agencies and humanitarian actors must incorporate survivor-centered approaches in ensuring inclusion of the rights and well-being of LGBTQ persons affected by the crisis in Myanmar. Thank you.
And now a video statement by internationallawyers.org.
Internationallawyers.org welcomes the work of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar. As an NGO that prioritizes respect for the rule of international law, we welcome the 3 analytical reports that will be shared with the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. These reports undertake essential legal tasks related to the application of international law generally concerning state responsibility, as well as individual responsibility under international criminal law. We especially welcome the analysis of the structure and reporting lines within the military and the analysis of the failure of the authorities to investigate crimes. Such analyses are essential to ensuring the proper application of both state and individual responsibility under international law. We urge the Council to consider undertaking similar analytical studies in other situations of military coups that have been followed by widespread and systematic human rights violations, such as in Egypt, where authorities who came to power by a military coup in 2013 remain in power, undertaking widespread and systematic violations of Egyptians' human rights. Thank you.
Christian Solidarity Worldwide, in person. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. CSW welcomes the report of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar and thanks the mechanism for its continued work. We share the grave concerns that the Myanmar military are increasingly committing horrific acts of extreme violence against civilians. Those living in ethnic minority areas are particularly targeted with intensity. Free Burma Rangers reports that on the 10th of May, the Myanmar military attacked Kor Bin Tham village in Karen State, killing 22 people, 7 of whom were children under 10 years of age. Most had been burnt alive and some bore signs of torture. 1 villager had been killed by full-body impalement. Such atrocity crimes are continuing even as we speak today. The burning of young children shows just how brazen the military are. We once again urge member states to coordinate the enforcement of a global arms embargo, and the closing of any loopholes to evade these measures. Over 1.9 million people are internally displaced, and 1/3 of Myanmar's population is in urgent need of aid, yet assistance from the international community is severely underfunded. According to the OCHA, the 2023 Myanmar Humanitarian Response Plan is only 25.4% funded as of the 23rd of August. The military junta has blocked the delivery of life-saving assistance in some regions. We call upon Member States to increase their funding to support those in greatest need and work with local aid organisations to provide life-saving support. Thank you.
Thank you. And now another video statement by Juventum now.
Mr. President, distinguished experts, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Juventum is honored to participate. We commend the independent investigative mechanism for the annual report 54/19, despite the difficulty of access on the ground. The accumulated information will be valuable in the future judicial processes. The original mandating Council Resolution 39/2 was in 2018. The recent military takeover of the government was in February 2021. It is an autumn 2023 now. The situation and the Myanmar government's attitude toward the human rights issues can vary in different aspects. What are your experts' observations on this? What would you suggest for future resolutions in the Council based on your insights and the information you have collected? It would be nice to hear from you what the suffering people really want. The Constitution was taken advantage of by the military junta in 2021. Unless it is corrected, history can easily repeat itself in Myanmar from now. What are your expert suggestions for the future constitution and the human rights policy of the government? Are there any suggestions for the future recovery phase? Thank you very much for your attention.
And now a video statement by International Bar Association.
The International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute, the Law Council of Australia, with the Law Society of England and Wales, Lawyers Rights Watch Canada, and Lawyers for Lawyers continue to condemn the ongoing atrocity crimes committed by the junta in Myanmar. Since the coup, the junta continues to target pro-democracy activists, human rights defenders, including lawyers and journalists, and civil society, shrinking civic and political space. Sham trials continue, and political prisoners face lengthy prison sentences or the death penalty in breach of all international fair trial standards. The military has completely captured the judiciary, and lawyers not only face closed courts and lack of due process, but are harassed, intimidated, threatened, and arbitrarily arrested, particularly when defending political cases. As of September 2023, the Assistance Association of Political Prisoners estimates that at least 38 lawyers are in pre-trial detention with little evidence supporting the charges against them, or serving sentences under various laws, including Section 505A of the Penal Code and amended provisions of the Counter-Terrorism Law. We urge this Council and the High Commissioner to continue to robustly respond to the deteriorating situation in Myanmar and to the international community to call for a moratorium on the death penalty and use all possible means to hold the junta accountable for all international crimes that are being committed. Thank you.
And now let me give the floor to Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development, please.
We welcome the report of the IIMM and commend the progress in fulfilling its mandate, especially in collection of first-hand testimonial evidence, witness protection, and expanding and diversifying collaboration with civil society. We share deep concerns about the broad range of grave international crimes being committed by the Myanmar military since February 2021. Holding the military accountable is essential to end the ongoing violence and facilitate safe, voluntary, dignified, and sustainable return of Rohingya refugees. However, we are disappointed that instead of advancing accountability, many states, including many in this council, continue to actively facilitate the junta's atrocities by providing it weapons and legitimacy. We remain concerned that the mechanism still does not have access to Myanmar. As a result, as the report indicates, the mechanism's work relies significantly on local Myanmar civil society organizations, including many that are working in areas under severe military attack. How can the Council, Member States and other stakeholders support and provide direct resources for and promote safety of organizations on the ground working to facilitate the mechanism's work? What additional support does the mechanism need to enhance and strengthen its field engagement as envisaged in the Resolution 39/2 beyond conducting investigative missions to refugee camps? Finally, we reiterate our call on the UN and the international community to explore all avenues for accountability, including through referral of Myanmar to the ICC or the establishment of an ad hoc tribunal. I thank you.
Thank you. And now let me give the floor to International Commission of Jurists. You have the floor, please.
Mr. President, the ICJ commends the IIMM for taking important steps in the last year to address significant victim and witness protection issues, to launch civil society dialogues, and to prioritize investigations of crimes against persons from marginalized groups. The ICJ encourages the IIMM to continue in this vein and strengthen such efforts. In addition, the ICJ would like to bring attention to the deteriorating human rights and security situation in each of Myanmar's neighboring states, which complicates the work of the IIMM and frustrates efforts to protect victims and witnesses seeking to contribute to accountability efforts. The authorities in India, Thailand, and Bangladesh have a responsibility to ensure the protection of Myanmar refugees, and state action in this regard has been insufficient. Further, despite multiple calls by this Council, access to border states is extremely limited to the IIMM, notwithstanding large Myanmar populations trapped at each of these borders. The ICJ appeals to the Council to reiterate in the strongest terms states' responsibility to protect Myanmar refugees in their territory, the imperative of allowing access to the IIMM to border regions of neighboring states of Myanmar, and to call on all states to work with the IIMM and civil society to formulate protection measures for victims and witnesses who are actively needing to evade expanding violence in the region, including on an individual and urgent basis. I thank you.
Thank you. And the last speaker I'll be able to accommodate for this dialogue is Lawyers Rights Watch Canada, intervention by video.
Mr. President, Lawyers Rights Watch Canada, the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute, Lawyers for Lawyers, and the Law Society of England and Wales thank the investigative mechanism for its crucial work, including engagement with civil society who face escalating danger of persecution amid the junta's brazen and indiscriminate attacks on civilians. Those reporting violations risk reprisals, including judicial harassment and arbitrary detention with denial of legal representation and other fair trial rights. Lawyers whose training equips them to gather evidence of violations face restrictions, intimidation, surveillance, threats, fabricated charges, and arbitrary detention. Lawyers are denied access to Myanmar's numerous forcibly disappeared clients. At least 38 lawyers are themselves arbitrarily detained, including dismaying reports of severe torture. We urge the Council to ensure adequate resources for the investigative mechanism to fulfill its mandate. We urge all Council members, observer states, UN bodies, ASEAN members, and corporations to halt any statements or actions that legitimize the junta, ensure protection of those fleeing violations in Myanmar, and promote a strong Security Council resolution for an arms embargo, sanctions, and referral to the International Criminal Court. Thank you.
Mr. Kumjan, let me give the floor back to you, and let me ask you for your concluding remarks. You have like 14 minutes and 30 seconds. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. There were several questions related to the mechanism's relationship with civil society organizations that are interested in working in the area of accountability for crimes in Myanmar. And first, when we say we greatly appreciate their efforts, they're key to us. Many times they're the start of our investigations because they give us the general information that points us in the direction of where the direct evidence can be found. then there was a question from the European Union about our dialogue with civil society, which we conducted this year, and the benefits of that. We feel like we learned a lot, and when we surveyed the participants in that dialogue, they told us that this communication helped them better understand our mechanism, how we work, what we can do, and also, very importantly, what we cannot do. So, for example, we know that many are frustrated with the fact that much of our information we don't share. It's not public. But that's because we're conducting a criminal investigation, and most of the information is received with the understanding that it is confidential. We don't share the information without the consent of those that gave it to us. So this kind of dialogue and exchange of views, I think, was very helpful. It gave us a better idea of how we need to perhaps increase and change some of our messaging so that people better understand what we do, what we can do, and what we cannot do. I think all the members that expressed support for our mechanism's efforts, and there were several questions about what more can be done for us. Well, what states can do can begin with, we're collecting evidence. We're engaged in really law enforcement type activity. So we need the permission of the states in the territory that we're operating on to do that. Permission to talk to witnesses, to take statements, to collect evidence. So this is very important for us that states work with us to allow us to access to their territory for the purposes of conducting interviews, collecting information, and evidence. Witness protection, of course, is a key to our work, and we place that as a highest priority in how we operate. So that's very important, and we ourselves, of course, are not a police force. We don't have the ability to physically protect anyone, and we don't have the ability to give anyone permission to go to a place where they would be safer. For that, we need the cooperation of states. And so we have reached out to some of the states here, and we have received some cooperation, but that's very important that we receive cooperation from states in protecting witnesses. Some of the key witnesses are those that have inside information, always in war crimes cases and cases where you're dealing with mass crimes. The victims are less likely to have that, but those who are on the inside would have information that can be very valuable about what orders were given, what reports were received. Those persons are very important to protect, and we would need the assistance of states to be able to relocate these persons to a place where they would be safe and their evidence would be accessible to us and to the courts that would ultimately use the evidence. We also need sustainable resources. Given our lack of access to the territory, to the crime scenes, and to where many of the witnesses and victims are still located, Myanmar, we need to compensate. We're trying to compensate by being very innovative in how we approach different types of ways of collecting evidence and communicating to those who have the information. So we have, for example, created a very important open source unit that uses the latest technologies to find information on the internet in a safe way and preserve it so it could be used in court. We also need to have the technologies that are constantly evolving, but the very latest and most secure technologies to communicate with those that are not in safe places. So this is something we welcome the support of states that would be able to assist us in getting those kinds of technologies and resources. And another challenge that we're facing is a challenge created by our own success. We've collected millions of items of evidence in the Burmese language, and we simply need greater resources to be able to analyze that evidence, more individuals on our staff who speak the language and understand the context of the communications that are taking place and that are in the Burmese language. So these are some of the challenges that we are facing. And then there was a question, several persons mentioned ASEAN and the importance of the 5-point plan. And the colleague from Indonesia, His Excellency, asked what the mechanism can do to help with a political solution. While a political solution is not our mandate, we do believe that our role contributes to the ASEAN 5-point plan. The very first point is end the violence. Unfortunately, we all can see that hasn't happened yet. The violence is not ending, it's only increasing. But if you want to end the violence, definitely you need to send a message to perpetrators that we're collecting evidence, that those who are committing violence should know that they could face the consequences of their actions, and that the international community is united to see that the evidence is collected and one day there will be justice. So we think very much that our work can do that. It can assist in that process of ensuring the first point of the ASEAN 5-point plan, the end of violence there. There was a question about hate speech from Bulgaria. Our colleague has actually asked about what the mechanism can do or recommend about how to counter hate speech. Well, one of the projects that we've undertaken and that has been mentioned in our report was that we have prepared an analysis of hate speech against the Rohingya that our report finds was an organized effort by the Myanmar military. And I think any time you're able to document such efforts, it helps to encourage people not to engage in such behavior. It deters such behavior. So we believe that by supporting our efforts to collect evidence of this hate speech, and states can also do that in their national laws to ensure that such, when hate speech does appear, the evidence is preserved and then shared with agencies like ourselves, law enforcement agencies that are interested in collecting evidence of these crimes. And so also there was a question about how the mechanism verifies information that we receive. Well, we verify information by collecting all information, whether it's incriminating or exonerating, and we try as much as possible to engage directly with those that have the information. So many of the CSOs that can help us by providing information, that's a first step where we then can hopefully, with their assistance, engage directly with those that have the information. We try to collect witness statements that are signed under oath by the witnesses themselves, and where we take very detailed statements about what they actually saw and heard. And we believe this all contributes to the ultimate goal of having evidence that's reliable and verified that can be shared with mechanisms interested in the accountability for these crimes. So I thank you all very much for your questions and for the support we've received from this council.
Thank you. This brings us to the end of this interactive dialogue, and let me express our thanks to the members of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, and I really appreciate your active participation as well. We will now take a short break before the interactive dialogue on the written update of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on the situation of human rights in Sri Lanka. So, 2 minutes break. Thank you. Excellencies, colleagues, we will now begin the interactive dialogue on the written update of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on the situation of human rights in Sri Lanka, as mandated in the Council Resolution 51/1. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes, and it's my pleasure and honor to welcome Ms. Nada Al-Nashif, Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights. You have the floor, Madam.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, Your Excellencies, colleagues and friends. Pursuant to its Resolution 51/1 of October 2022, the Council has been presented with the written update of the High Commissioner on the situation of human rights in Sri Lanka. 1 year after the remarkable protest movement demanding deep political and democratic reforms, the transformation that was hoped for to address long-standing challenges has still not materialized. The country continues to deal with the aftermath of the deep economic crisis of 2022 and the current stresses in the global economy. Delays in holding local government elections and in reconstituting provincial councils under the 13th Amendment have limited people's right to political participation and the free expression of voters. While the economic crisis has significantly affected the enjoyment of rights of large segments of the population in Sri Lanka, it has impacted the poor and the marginalized communities the most. As the country's poverty rate has doubled from 13% in 2021 to 25% last year, in 2022, another 2.5 million people have been driven into poverty, and an estimated 37% of households face acute food insecurity. As the government implements its economic recovery policies, it should be guided by its obligations under the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights to protect the most vulnerable. The international community, including international financial institutions, should keep supporting Sri Lanka in its recovery in line with obligations around international cooperation and assistance by providing the fiscal space needed while pressing for genuine progress in governance, transparency and accountability. The economic hardship, the tensions around economic and structural reform policies, and the delay of local elections continue to give rise to protests. Land acquisition in the north and east for expansion of military installations, Buddhist heritage conservation at Hindu or Muslim sites, and forestry protection have also escalated tensions. Our office continues to receive cases of misuse of tear gas and water cannons during demonstrations, affecting protesters and media personnel. Initiatives by victims to memorialize their loved ones have also been obstructed. These measures restricting the right to protest will only generate more tension in the country as they prevent people from expressing their grievances and engaging in critical debate. It is imperative that the government ensures an environment that respects free expression, peaceful assembly, and democratic space as the basis for reconciliation and social cohesion. The report provides an analysis of concerns with some forthcoming legislation, in particular the proposed anti-terrorism bill that will replace the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and the new law to regulate media broadcasting. It urges a moratorium on the use of the PTA in the meantime and for the review of long-standing PTA cases to be expedited. 14 years since the war ended, tens of thousands of victims and their families continue to suffer in agony and grief as they await truth, justice and remedy. The report recognizes the initiatives of the government to advance reconciliation, including its proposal for a new truth-seeking mechanism. However, it also stresses that urgent confidence-building steps are needed to create an environment in which a genuine reconciliation and transitional justice processes can succeed. These include meaningful and transparent consultations with victims and civil society on the current truth-seeking proposal, and an end to all forms of harassment and unlawful and arbitrary surveillance against human rights defenders and victims groups, as well as support for initiatives to acknowledge and memorialize the experience of victims. Truth-seeking alone will not be sufficient and must be accompanied by a clear commitment to accountability, including through an independent ad hoc special court. The report recommends that the government accelerate investigations and prosecutions in emblematic cases of human rights violations, including the Easter Sunday bombings, in compliance with international human rights standards. The High Commissioner has repeatedly recommended that the government of Sri Lanka should establish a follow-up, independent and transparent investigation into the Easter Sunday attacks with international assistance and the full participation of victims and their representatives. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, while noting the government's rejection of resolutions 46/1 and 51/1, the report also updates on the work of the Accountability Project established by our office to collect, consolidate, analyze and preserve relevant information and evidence and provide support to relevant judicial and other proceedings, including those in member states with competent jurisdiction. The project is receiving a steady increase in requests from competent state authorities, including in relation to 10 named individuals to date. The project has made significant progress in developing a repository of information and evidence, and based on identifying gaps and priorities for further investigation. It is also actively engaging with civil society, including victims' representatives. Accountability is central to secure Sri Lanka's present and its future. While it remains the obligation of the Sri Lankan authorities to acknowledge past violations and undertake credible accountability measures, this Council and the Member States can play an important and complementary role in advancing accountability. My office remains committed to supporting the government and the people of Sri Lanka in advancing reconciliation and accountability, as well as the full enjoyment of human rights. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Madam Deputy High Commissioner. Now we will hear from the delegation of country concerned. So let me give the floor to the representative of Sri Lanka. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, let me reiterate that the government of Sri Lanka has consistently rejected resolutions 46/1 and 51/1 that led to the setting up of the so-called Accountability Project. We also reject the written update, its conclusions and recommendations. We recall that the majority of member states either opposed or abstained from voting on these resolutions in fundamental disagreement with their unacceptable content, in particular the so-called evidence-gathering mechanism, the establishment of which is unprecedented. We reiterate that it goes beyond the mandate that member states conferred on the Council by UNGA Resolution 60/251. Mr. President, these resolutions are intrusive and polarizing and upheld only by a handful of countries for reasons unrelated to human rights and based on their vote bank domestic politics. Many countries have raised serious concerns on the budgetary implications of this resolution, given its dubious mandate. Sri Lanka has repeatedly pointed out that this is an unproductive and unhelpful drain on the resources of the Council and its members. Therefore, Sri Lanka will not cooperate with it. However, as an active participant of the multilateral framework and in keeping with our close engagement with the international community and the Council in other areas of its work, Sri Lanka will continue to engage constructively with other mechanisms of the Council that have been productive and beneficial to our people, such as the UPR process. The content of the written update does not reflect the actual situation in Sri Lanka. The economic, social and financial stabilization Sri Lanka has achieved in the past year has been appreciated and acknowledged domestically and externally. Those who are mandated and have the expertise to deal with economic and financial reforms remain confident in the country's prospects. It is also regrettable that the OHCHR has chosen to ignore the democratic resilience of the country and its institutions demonstrated in the past year. Sri Lanka is deeply concerned at the ever-increasing mandate of the OHCHR in making sweeping and intrusive comments on all aspects of economic, financial, electoral, political, domestic, budgetary and development policies. We strongly object to pronouncements on policy matters that are essentially domestic for any sovereign country and outside the framework of this Council. In its simplistic analysis, the OHCHR also refers to challenges Sri Lanka is facing in the food, health and nutrition and education sectors as if it is an isolated phenomenon affecting Sri Lanka alone. In New York, the UN Secretary General, in solidarity with developing countries in debt and financial distress arising from the current global context, is highlighting sympathetically the severe setbacks and challenges encountered by all developing countries in achieving the SDGs. Sri Lanka also rejects the references to targeted sanctions that are based on incorrect and unsubstantiated sources, contravening the principles of natural justice, of universality, impartiality, objectivity, and non-selectivity. Mr. President, Sri Lanka remains firmly committed to pursuing tangible progress on human rights through our domestic institutions and have made significant progress. In a statement to Parliament on 9th August this year, President Wickremesinghe outlined the government's vision and progress made in reconciliation efforts undertaken, inter alia in legislative reforms, institutional activities, land issues, resettlement, North and East development, and 13th Amendment. All-party conferences have been convened to consolidate political support for these efforts. The Anti-Corruption Act No. 9 of 2023 has strengthened the financial and functional independence of the Commission to investigate allegations of bribery and corruption. Deliberations continue on the draft anti-terrorism bill with the aim of bringing it in line with international standards. Tangible progress has been made by independent domestic mechanisms, inter alia the Office on Missing Persons, Office for Reparations, and Office for National Unity and Reconciliation, and details are provided in our written observations to the report. The Interim Secretariat for the Truth and Reconciliation Mechanism is established. The proposed mechanism has been identified as a meaningful way to secure the peace achieved after 3 decades of brutal conflict. Consultations are ongoing, including with civil society, on the proposed mechanism. The Office for Overseas Sri Lankan Affairs functions as a central point to engage with overseas Sri Lankans, promoting reconciliation through dialogue and understanding. Mr. President, we have provided our observations in detail to this written update to counter grave distortions in the document and its misrepresentation of the ground situation in Sri Lanka. We request that our response be given equal visibility as OHCHR report. Notwithstanding our position on the HRC resolution, as a responsible member of the international community, Sri Lanka will continue to engage constructively with the UN in keeping with domestic priorities and policies, as well as the international obligations voluntarily undertaken. I would like to end by conveying Sri Lanka's sympathies to the people of Morocco at this difficult time. Thank you.
Thank you. And now let me open the floor for delegations. And the first one on my list is New Zealand.
Mr. President and Deputy High Commissioner, before I begin, let me convey the New Zealand Government's sincere condolences to the government and people of Morocco for the tragedy and devastation of their earthquake. Aotearoa New Zealand thanks the Office of the High Commissioner for the report and welcomes the continued attention on and support offered to Sri Lanka. We welcome Sri Lanka's progress in stabilising its economy following the country's acute economic crisis. We will continue to offer assistance as appropriate. As the recovery continues, we agree that economic reform measures should uphold the basic economic, social and cultural rights of Sri Lankans. Civil and political rights are also important of themselves and in supporting long-term economic prosperity. They provide people with avenues for offering ideas and expressing disagreement legitimately. We therefore urge Sri Lanka to promptly hold legally prescribed elections which are now overdue, while ensuring all future elections are scheduled in a timely manner according to the law, and to safeguard the fundamental freedoms of expression, peaceful assembly and association. New Zealand strongly supports reconciliation and accountability for human rights violations, with a victim-centric approach at the forefront of that work. We acknowledge Sri Lanka's recent focus on reconciliation, including the proposed establishment of a National Unity and Reconciliation Commission. While encouraging these efforts, we strongly urge greater participation of and increased consultation with affected communities in order to promote enduring peace and stability. Thank you.
Thank you. The European Union, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The EU welcomes the OHCHR report. We reaffirm our commitment to human rights, reconciliation and accountability in Sri Lanka. While the EU recognizes the challenges Sri Lanka has been facing due to the economic and financial crisis throughout last year, we underline the need for upholding all human rights, including the rights to freedom of opinion, expression and assembly, as well as the effective and equal fulfillment of economic, social and cultural rights of all persons in Sri Lanka, including persons in vulnerable and marginalized situations. Recognizing the positive course of action over the past months, leading the country towards economic stabilization, the EU continues to call for reconciliation, accountability, and resolving the many cases of enforced disappearances. We take note of plans for reconciliation mechanisms and the President's dialogue with Tamil political parties, as well as the promise to stop land acquisitions for archaeological, forestry, or security purposes. However, these still need to be turned into concrete actions. The EU calls on Sri Lanka to enable the right of peaceful assembly and refrain from any use of force against peaceful demonstrators. We call upon Sri Lanka to suspend the Prevention of Terrorism Act until it is in full compliance with international human rights law and standards, and also call for accountability and immediate action to end impunity. The EU encourages the government of Sri Lanka to remain engaged with the UN and international partners and to fully cooperate with the High Commissioner. The EU will continue to support Sri Lanka's efforts towards a fully inclusive dialogue on governance, rule of law, democratic renewal, as well as human rights. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Colleagues, the list of speakers is now closed, and I'm inviting the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
This statement is by the Sri Lanka Core Group comprising Canada, North Macedonia, Malawi, Montenegro, the United Kingdom and the United States. Deputy High Commissioner, we welcome your report on Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has made important recent commitments on land issues and devolution of political authority. We encourage Sri Lanka to turn these commitments into meaningful action and deliver long-awaited results. Sri Lanka still has a long way to go to fulfill commitments to justice, accountability and reconciliation. We note preparations for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and emphasise the importance of an inclusive participatory process in the establishment of any mechanisms to advance transitional justice, to gain the confidence of all affected communities in line with international best practices. We are concerned by continued incidents of intimidation and harassment of civil society and journalists and by the arbitrary use of laws to suppress dissent. As Sri Lanka takes forward its economic recovery, we stress the importance of effective governance reforms and note the recent anti-corruption legislation. This must be accompanied by safeguarding established independent institutions and democratic processes. We call on Sri Lanka to work with the High Commissioner and his office and remain ready to support Sri Lanka in addressing HRC Resolution 51/1. Thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite Oman.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. ألقي هذا البيان نيابة عن الدول الأعضاء في مجلس التعاون لدول الخليج العربية، ونود بداية أن نضم صوتنا بتقديم خالص التعازي للضحايا في المغرب الشقيق حكومة وشعبا. السيد الرئيس، تؤكد دول مجلس التعاون على دعمها للحوارات المفتوحة والفعالة بهدف تعزيز وتطوير ممارسات حقوق الإنسان. وقد أخذت دول مجلس التعاون علما بتقرير المفوض السامي لحقوق الإنسان حول سريلانكا، واطلعت باهتمام على جهود الحكومة السريلانكية لتعزيز المصالحة والمساءلة عن انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان، لا سيما المؤتمر العام الذي عقدته في ديسمبر 2022 ويناير 2023، وما نتج عنه من مخرجات إيجابية تصب في هدف تعزيز المصالحة والمساءلة. وفي هذا السياق تحث دول المجلس على ضرورة استمرار حكومة سريلانكا باتخاذ الخطوات اللازمة لضمان فعالية الحوار للوصول إلى المصالحة الوطنية التي تهدف إلى تحقيق الاستقرار وضمان اعتماد رؤية مشتركة لتعزيز حقوق الإنسان على أراضيها، وعلى أهمية دعم الجهود التي تقوم بها الحكومة عبر التعاون الفني وبناء القدرات في هذا المجال. السيد الرئيس، تؤكد دول المجلس على أن تعزيز حقوق الإنسان وحمايتها مسؤولية جماعية تتطلب عملا مكثفا وحوارا مشتركا في إطار الثقة والاحترام المتبادل والالتزام بمبادئ الحياد والموضوعية والتعاون الدائم لجهود الدول للوفاء بالتزاماتها في مجال حقوق الإنسان. وشكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you. Liechtenstein is the next.
First, I would like to also express my sincere condolences to the people of Morocco on the terrible losses caused by the recent earthquake. We thank the High Commissioner for the presentation of the report on the human rights situation in Sri Lanka. We note the efforts made by the government towards justice, accountability and reconciliation, including the latest proposed National Unity and Reconciliation Commission. Nevertheless, past ad hoc bodies, such as the Office of Missing Persons, have failed to gather the support of victims and ensure accountability. Accountability is a crucial step towards sustainable peace, and in this regard, we are pleased to hear about progress made with the OHCHR's accountability project. At the same time, we urge the government of Sri Lanka to step up its responsibility to undertake credible investigations and prosecutions of human rights violations. Moreover, we're concerned about the shrinking civic space, in particular the attacks on freedom of assembly, namely through arbitrary arrests of protesters and forceful crowd control measures, or harassment and intimidation, preventing people from protesting. We call on the government of Sri Lanka to ensure the rights of freedom of peaceful assembly as well as expression, and not to stop targeting journalists, and to stop targeting journalists and human rights defenders. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Now let me invite Egypt.
السيد الرئيس، يأخذ وفد مصر علما بتقرير المفوض السامي لحقوق الإنسان حول سريلانكا، ويؤكد وفد مصر أهمية الالتزام بمبادئ العالمية والموضوعية وعدم الانتقائية عند النظر في قضايا حقوق الإنسان في سريلانكا، والابتعاد عن تسييس حقوق الإنسان واستغلالها للتدخل في الشؤون الداخلية، مع أهمية إيلاء عناية ببناء قدرات المؤسسات الوطنية والتعاون الفني. كما يعيد وفد مصر التأكيد على أهمية مواصلة المجلس ومكتب المفوض السامي تعزيز الحوار والتنسيق مع سريلانكا، وذلك لضمان تحقيق مردود إيجابي وتقديم الدعم اللازم وفقا للأولويات الوطنية وفي ظل الاحترام الكامل لسيادتها. شكرا سيدي الرئيس.
Thank you. Luxembourg is the next.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le Luxembourg s'associe à la déclaration de l'Union européenne. Nous remercions la haut-commissaire adjointe pour son rapport, dont nous saluons les conclusions. Pour être juste et durable, la reprise après la grave crise économique au Sri Lanka doit s'accompagner de réformes institutionnelles et politiques profondes, ainsi que d'une rupture avec la culture d'impunité pour les violations et les abus des droits humains. Le rapport du Haut-Commissariat contient un vaste éventail de recommandations en matière de réforme de la justice, de protection contre la discrimination de minorités ethniques et religieuses, ou encore de lutte contre la corruption. Le Luxembourg encourage vivement le Sri Lanka à mettre en œuvre ces recommandations. Nous sommes préoccupés par les atteintes aux droits civils et politiques, par l'absence de résultats tangibles dans la lutte contre l'impunité et par la militarisation de fonctions gouvernementales civiles. Les autorités devraient en outre s'abstenir de tout recours à la force contre les manifestants pacifiques et faire cesser toute intimidation contre les voix dissidentes. La loi sur la prévention du terrorisme devrait être amendée afin qu'elle soit pleinement conforme au droit international des droits humains. Pour conclure, Madame la haut-commissaire adjointe, quels sont les points de départ concrets les plus prometteurs pour le Sri Lanka et ses partenariats internationaux pour instaurer un dialogue national inclusif sur la gouvernance, l'état de droit, les valeurs démocratiques et les droits humains? Je vous remercie.
Merci à vous. Germany, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I would like to express Germany's sincere condolences to the people of Morocco for the terrible losses caused by the earthquake. Germany aligns itself with the statement by the EU. We thank the Office of the High Commissioner for the report and welcome their work. As a co-author of last year's resolution, Germany reaffirms its commitment to fostering peace, reconciliation and respect for human rights in Sri Lanka. We stand with all people of the country in their quest for a better future. We recognize the burden the people of Sri Lanka are facing following the economic crisis, and we reaffirm our commitment to human rights, reconciliation and accountability in Sri Lanka, and commend recent initiatives for dialogue, as well as the suspension of land acquisition, in particular in the north of the country. However, lasting peace and stability can only be built on true accountability for the past and strong protection of human rights in the future. We therefore call on the government of Sri Lanka to implement meaningful steps for accountability and reconciliation. We take note in this regard of the President's initiative to form a truth-finding mechanism to account for Sri Lanka's civil war. We continue to call on the government of Sri Lanka to repeal the Prevention of Terrorism Act to allow for reforms bringing the legal framework in compliance with international human rights obligations. Madam Deputy High Commissioner, how can the government of Sri Lanka improve cooperation with the UN human rights system to foster such a meaningful reconciliation? Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Maintenant, je passe la parole à la France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, la France s'associe à la déclaration de l'Union européenne et remercie le Haut-Commissariat pour son rapport. Depuis 2015, ce Conseil adopte une approche coopérative afin d'aider les autorités sri-lankaises à mettre un terme aux violations et abus des droits de l'homme documentés par les rapports successifs du Haut-Commissariat et assurer reconnaissance et réparation aux victimes. Comme vous le soulignez, la situation des droits de l'homme à Sri Lanka souffre en plus depuis plusieurs mois de la crise économique à laquelle est confronté le pays, avec des difficultés accrues d'accès à l'alimentation, aux soins de santé ou encore à l'éducation. La France salue les efforts déployés par les autorités du Sri Lanka pour ce qui est du redressement de l'économie. Elle encourage les autorités à poursuivre les efforts pour aboutir à un état de droit respectueux de la diversité de la population. Elle souligne la nécessité de poursuivre dans ce sens, dans l'intérêt de tous les Sri Lankais, en appelant en particulier les autorités du Sri Lanka à préserver les libertés d'expression et de réunion pacifique. La France appelle aussi le Sri Lanka à mettre pleinement à profit l'assistance du Haut-Commissariat des Nations Unies aux droits de l'homme, mise en place par le Conseil des droits de l'homme, pour les accompagner dans le cadre du processus de réconciliation nationale. Elle appelle enfin à maintenir le moratoire en vue de l'abolition de la peine de mort. Je vous remercie.
Merci à vous. Now let me invite the delegation of the United States of America.
Thank you, Mr. President. The United States appreciates the Council's continued attention to Sri Lanka and welcomes the High Commissioner's report. As it navigates its economic recovery, we recognize Sri Lanka's strengthened reforms, including anti-corruption legislation. We also welcome the government's release on bail of over 100 individuals held without trial under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. We commend initial progress on land returns. However, we must note our concerns about other land grabs in the north and east. We remain concerned about tensions at religious sites and minority communities, government pressure on civil society, and the absence of local elections since 2018. We encourage meaningful consultations in finalizing the Anti-Terrorism Act and hope these discussions help bring the law into alignment with international best practices. We urge Sri Lanka to ensure transitional justice institutions operate credibly and effectively. Reconciliation initiatives should be victim-centered, inclusive, impartial, transparent, and independent. Governments that ensure freedom of expression and peaceful protests enjoy greater peace and stability. How can we best support the Sri Lankan government and people to develop a credible reconciliation process and pursue accountability? I thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite Japan.
Mr. President and Madam Deputy High Commissioner for your briefings. Japan takes note of the Deputy High Commissioner's report and appreciates Sri Lanka's engagement in its preparation. Japan believes it's vital for Sri Lanka to take further voluntary actions and provide remedies to achieve a meaningful reconciliation and to improve its human rights situation through dialogue with all domestic and international stakeholders, including OHCHR. In this regard, Japan acknowledged the amendment to the Prevention of Terrorism Act as an important initial step and encourages Sri Lanka's further efforts to impose a moratorium on the PTA and enact fair and comprehensive counter-terrorism legislation. Japan supports Sri Lanka's efforts to establish a transnational justice mechanism, including the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and recommends the Commission to effectively respond to the will of the Sri Lanka's people. Japan will continue to support Sri Lanka on both the human rights and the economic fronts, including through its ongoing capacity building assistance in the area of justice. I thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker on my list is Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, let me start by expressing solidarity with the people and government of Morocco following the devastating earthquake. Israel extends its deepest sympathy to the grieving families, prays for the injured, and is ready to assist as needed. Mr. President, Israel takes note of the High Commissioner's report on Sri Lanka. Israel is concerned by the severe economic crisis that hit Sri Lanka in 2022, which significantly impacted the enjoyment of rights. Israel welcomes the news that the economy has appeared to stabilise in 2023 and that shortages in fuel, electricity, food, medicines and other essentials has been partly alleviated. That being said, food insecurity remains a major barrier to the enjoyment of human rights. It's essential that underlying factors of the economic crisis are addressed, including corruption, centralisation of power, lack of transparency and the unresolved legacy of conflict. All necessary measures should be taken to guarantee people's economic and social rights during this economic crisis. Mr. President, in addition to this, Israel calls for all cases of enforced disappearances and mass graves to be fully investigated, and for the right to freedom and of expression and assembly to be guaranteed, and welcomes steps taken in this regard. I thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président, la Suisse remercie le Haut-Commissaire pour son rapport sur la situation au Sri Lanka. Nous saluons les efforts du gouvernement au sujet de la réconciliation et des réformes pour renforcer l'état de droit. Nous l'encourageons à mener un processus de justice transitionnelle qui soit inclusif, centré sur les victimes, transparent et qui respecte les standards internationaux. La recherche sur la vérité ne suffira pas à elle seule. Elle doit s'accompagner d'un engagement en faveur de la reddition des comptes et d'une volonté politique de mettre en œuvre des changements profonds. Ce processus ne peut pas non plus exclure des progrès réels en matière de justice. Par conséquent, la Suisse exhorte les autorités sri-lankaises à coopérer avec le Sri Lanka Accountability Project. La Suisse est préoccupée par l'utilisation abusive de la loi sur la promotion du terrorisme de 1979 et de la loi sur le pacte international relatif aux droits civils et politiques qui ne répondent pas à la résolution 51.1 du Conseil. Nous notons avec inquiétude qu'elles servent à réprimer les droits à la liberté d'expression et à mener des arrestations arbitraires des voix dissidentes. Elle facilite aussi le recours excessif à la force et aux ordonnances judiciaires préventives à l'encontre des manifestants. Madame la haut-commissaire adjointe, la Suisse se tient prête à faciliter les plateformes de dialogue pour processus de réconciliation au Sri Lanka. Je vous remercie.
Merci à vous. Turkey, you have the floor.
Mr. President, we take note of the active and constructive participation of Sri Lanka in the regular United Nations human rights mechanisms. A large part of the Sri Lankan population, especially the most vulnerable groups, including children, are still deeply affected by the economic crisis. The report also highlights these difficult conditions. Sri Lankan society has clearly demonstrated its desire to build a prosperous and peaceful country through demonstrations organized by large groups from diverse backgrounds. We are pleased to see a series of significant reforms, not only in the economic sector, but also in the areas of governance, the legal system, and social welfare. We welcome the steps taken to advance the reconciliation process, establishment of the Constitutional Council, and to improve the independence of both Human Rights Commission as well as the Election Commission. We also appreciate the adoption of the new anti-corruption and anti-terrorism legislation in line with the international standards, promotion of women's rights, and strengthening of accountability measures. We hope that these reforms will pave the way to achieve stability in the economic, political, and social systems in the country. We believe that these reforms should be inclusive and encourage all ethnic and religious groups that make up the Sri Lankan society to work together. Sri Lanka's efforts should be supported in a constructive manner by this international community. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker on my list is Canada.
Thank you, Deputy High Commissioner, for the update. Mr. President, Canada remains concerned by persistent violations of human rights and freedoms in Sri Lanka. We welcome Sri Lanka's positive engagement with the UPR process in January and encourage Sri Lanka to use the current period of reform to implement constructive changes that advance inclusive governance, including support for the rights of ethnic and religious minorities. Canada continues to stress the importance of inclusive transitional justice that includes a focus on accountability for human rights violations, an end to impunity, and a commitment to reconciliation. We encourage Sri Lanka to adopt a proactive and transparent approach to investigating the recently discovered suspected mass grave site in Kokotho Divai. Canada will continue to support the people of Sri Lanka as they exercise their rights of freedom of peaceful assembly, association, and expression, and we urge Sri Lanka to uphold these rights. We acknowledge that Sri Lanka is developing legislation to replace the PTA and urge Sri Lanka to ensure the legislation is consistent with its international human rights commitments. While encouraged by the Supreme Court's decision that paves the way for Sri Lanka to decriminalize consensual same-sex relations, Canada remains concerned that relevant sections of the Penal Code unjustly target same-sex couples and calls on Sri Lanka to repeal these harmful sections. Madam Deputy High Commissioner, how can the OHCHR and the international community play a constructive role in helping Sri Lanka concretely advance peace-building, reconciliation, and accountability? Thank you.
Thank you. And the last speaker I'll be able to accommodate is Cuba.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. La cooperación y el diálogo respetuoso sobre la base de los principios de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas constituyen el único camino a seguir para garantizar la promoción y protección efectiva de los derechos humanos. La resolución que da origen a este diálogo no cuenta con el apoyo del país concernido. Cualquier acción o mandato que de ella se derive será contraproducente, como lo han sido la mayoría de los mecanismos punitivos aprobados por este Consejo. Mecanismos de este tipo solo atizan la politización y la proliferación de los dobles raseros que se han impuesto en el Consejo y no contribuyen en modo alguno a la promoción y protección de los derechos humanos en el país. Señor presidente, en lugar de mecanismos de esta naturaleza, el Consejo debe privilegiar la genuina cooperación con la Oficina del Alto Comisionado sobre la base del respeto mutuo, así como el empleo de mecanismos universales como el examen periódico universal como única garantía para abordar de manera justa y no selectiva las cuestiones de derechos humanos en todos los países. Cuba continuará defendiendo estos principios en todos los órganos intergubernamentales pertinentes, particularmente en el Consejo de Derechos Humanos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished guests. It is now my honor to invite Son Excellence Monsieur Eugène Belambela, Ministre des Relations Extérieures du Cameroun, to address the Council. Excellency, you have the floor.
Monsieur le Président, ma délégation exprime ses sincères condoléances et sa solidarité au peuple frère du Maroc en ce moment difficile et pénible que connaît ce pays suite au séisme qu'il vient de vivre. Monsieur le Président, je vous remercie pour l'occasion que vous m'offrez de pouvoir m'adresser à l'auguste Conseil ce jour. Je suis heureux de me retrouver dans cette mythique salle dans laquelle se construit au quotidien l'humanisme dans toutes ses dimensions conformément à l'esprit de la Charte des Nations Unies. C'est aussi un réel privilège pour moi, à la veille du 75e anniversaire de la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme et à quelques mois du passage de mon pays à l'examen périodique universel, de pouvoir livrer à mon siège ici la vision du Cameroun sur les grandes problématiques contemporaines en rapport avec les droits de l'homme et la protection de la dignité humaine. Permettez-moi, Monsieur le Président du Conseil, Excellence, Monsieur l'ambassadeur Václav Balek, de vous réitérer les sincères félicitations de ma délégation pour l'excellente conduite de nos travaux depuis le début de l'année. Je voudrais vous rassurer une fois encore du soutien constant de la délégation du Cameroun au succès de votre mandat. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, je voudrais spécialement rendre un hommage appuyé au haut-commissaire, M. Volker Turk, pour le travail remarquable que lui et ses équipes abattent dans l'accomplissement du mandat. Un mandat délicat qui leur est confié en dépit d'un contexte international particulièrement difficile. Je voudrais également, dans la suite de mon propos, renouveler l'engagement ferme et irréversible de son Excellence M. Paul Biya, chef de l'État, président de la République du Cameroun, en faveur de la préservation et de la promotion des droits humains en vue de la construction d'un monde fondé sur plus de justice, fondé également sur plus d'équité et respectueux de la diversité des cultures. Excellents Mesdames, Messieurs, notre Conseil a une mission noble, celle d'accompagner l'humanité à la réalisation de tous les droits fondamentaux de l'homme, tels que stipulés par la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme et bien d'autres textes pertinents, nationaux et internationaux. Il s'agit par conséquent d'une lourde responsabilité qui nous incombe, nous, les représentants des États et de bien d'autres acteurs internationaux, d'examiner, d'évaluer, d'apprécier, de dénoncer, entre autres, les comportements des États et des divers sujets de droit. Je ne pense pas avoir la voix si forte pour dire que 77 ans après l'adoption de la Charte des Nations Unies et 60 ans après nos indépendances, l'humanité tout entière n'arrive toujours pas à consolider tous ses fondements, au premier rang desquels les droits de l'homme dans toutes ses dimensions, politiques, civiles, économiques, sociales et culturelles. En effet, ces dernières années, force est de reconnaître que ces fondements ont été confrontés à des menaces qui se sont multipliées et complexifiées. Je me réfère tout d'abord à la pandémie de la Covid-19, aux nombreux foyers de tension observés ça et là, ainsi qu'aux conséquences néfastes du réchauffement climatique. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, mon pays, le Cameroun, salue le travail remarquable de l'ONU en matière de droits de l'homme et estime qu'il est néanmoins urgent de procéder aux réformes pertinentes du système international pour un multilatéralisme rénové et adapté aux défis de l'heure. À cet égard, nous pensons que le Comité des droits de l'homme s'affirme indubitablement comme le principal régulateur en matière d'alerte des défaillances observées dans la protection, la promotion et la garantie des droits de l'homme dans le monde. Le Cameroun, à l'instar des autres membres du Conseil, est conscient des nombreux défis auxquels est confronté le monde et œuvre de ce fait de concert avec les autres acteurs en vue de parvenir à l'épanouissement de l'homme. Au sommet de ces préoccupations figure en première place la quête permanente d'une paix et d'une sécurité durable pour notre planète. C'est pourquoi le Cameroun lance un appel à tous les pays à œuvrer en synergie à la matérialisation des 12 actions concrètes proposées dans le nouvel agenda pour la paix soumis par le secrétaire général des Nations Unies. Au plan national, la consolidation de l'état de droit et de la démocratie doit être notre priorité à tous. À ce sujet, il me plaît de réaffirmer l'attachement de mon pays à la dévolution du pouvoir par voie démocratique et au respect de l'ordre constitutionnel des États. Je voudrais par la même occasion saluer l'engagement du Haut Commissariat à l'assistance technique et au renforcement des capacités de nos États afin de nous accompagner dans l'instauration d'une véritable culture du respect des valeurs démocratiques et des droits de l'homme, gage de la paix, de la stabilité et du développement. C'est dans cet esprit que le Cameroun appuie la mission du Centre sous-régional des Nations Unies pour les droits de l'homme et la démocratie en Afrique centrale, dont le siège est à Yaoundé. Je m'en voudrais de ne pas relever au passage le satisfecit du chef de l'État du Cameroun qui a décidé d'offrir gracieusement de nouveaux locaux au Haut Commissariat plus adaptés aux besoins et aux ambitions du centre sous-régional. Pour ce qui est des crises sécuritaires majeures qui secouent notre planète en général et le continent africain en particulier, le Cameroun reste attaché au principe du règlement pacifique des différends en privilégiant la voie du dialogue et de la négociation, aussi bien sur le plan bilatéral que multilatéral. Il importe de relever que le défi de la paix, de la sécurité et du développement passe également par une politique commune et concertée de lutte contre la maladie. Tout à l'heure, j'ai parlé de la pandémie à Covid-19. Nous devons avoir une réponse globale. En cela, le Cameroun se réjouit et soutient le projet de traité en cours de préparation portant sur la prévention des pandémies, qui permettra aux pays du monde entier de renforcer les capacités nationales, régionales et mondiales, ainsi que la résilience face à de nouvelles ou à de futures pandémies. Je voudrais aussi saluer l'œuvre de l'OMC et de l'OMS qui travaillent dans la même direction et bien évidemment de tout système multilatéral dont l'ONU est à l'avant-garde. La condamnation sans équivoque du terrorisme sous toutes ses formes et la lutte contre ce fléau participent aussi de ce défi, pressant d'une quête pour la consolidation de la paix, de la sécurité et de la stabilité internationale. C'est dire que l'urgence d'un combat concerté et mondial contre ce phénomène est plus que jamais impérative. C'est d'autant plus que ce phénomène annihile lourdement les efforts de développement de plusieurs pays en général et de la sous-région, Afrique centrale en particulier, dans laquelle mon pays consent d'énormes ressources. Enfin, notre monde est exposé à une autre menace non négligeable et qui prend une dimension de plus en plus inquiétante. C'est la prolifération et la circulation de tout type d'armes et de munitions. Dans ce contexte, je voudrais saluer l'initiative de l'Union africaine visant à faire taire les armes et plaider au niveau global pour la redynamisation des activités de la conférence du désarmement. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, permettez-moi de réitérer à ce stade que notre mission principale reste la quête d'un avenir meilleur pour l'humanité, centré sur l'avènement d'une société où le respect et la protection des droits de l'homme demeurent une réalité concrète. C'est ce monde du futur, construit sur de nouveaux paradigmes, que nous voulons voir projeté à travers la célébration des 75 ans de la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme. Pour le Cameroun, cela passe par deux canaux essentiels et interdépendants, à savoir la réalisation des droits fondamentaux dits de première et de deuxième génération et l'implémentation des droits nouveaux à la suite des droits dits de troisième génération eu égard aux transformations de notre société à l'aune notamment de la révolution numérique. L'autre défi, et non des moindres, auquel le gouvernement du Cameroun s'active à la réalisation, porte sur son développement économique et social. Car il y a une corrélation indissociable entre le relèvement du niveau de vie des populations, la lutte contre la pauvreté et la misère sous toutes ses formes et la réalisation des droits de l'homme. C'est bien tout cela, le sens de la prise en compte par mon pays du pertinent agenda 2030 de l'ONU au travers de l'atteinte des ODD d'une part et de l'agenda 2063 de l'Union africaine d'autre part dans sa stratégie nationale de développement à l'horizon 2030 visant à faire du Cameroun un pays émergent à l'horizon 2035. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, je salue l'inscription à l'ordre du jour des travaux de la 54e session du Conseil de la question du droit au développement. Pour mon pays, il s'agit là d'un droit majeur, au même titre que tous les autres droits de l'homme, qui sont universels, inaliénables, indivisibles, interdépendants et intimement liés. Un droit auquel tous nos pays ont souscrit et se sont engagés à en faire une réalité dans leur gouvernance socio-économique, aussi bien à travers la Déclaration du droit au développement de 1986, d'une part, que celle du millénaire pour le développement de septembre 2000, d'autre part. Dans le même ordre d'idées, permettez-moi d'évoquer succinctement les nombreux défis écologiques liés au dérèglement climatique et à la perturbation de la biodiversité qu'on observe ça et là. Cette situation affecte directement les droits de l'homme et est source de plusieurs conflits intercommunautaires, notamment dans nos bassins du lac Tchad. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, je ne saurais terminer sans évoquer brièvement les évolutions positives observées dans la résolution des crises sécuritaires qui secouent mon pays depuis bientôt une dizaine d'années. Comme vous le savez bien, le Cameroun, qui est demeuré longtemps un îlot de paix, traverse une période de turbulence faite de crises affectant les droits de l'homme. Premièrement, c'est les exactions de la secte Boko Haram que nous avons à lutter. Grâce aux efforts et aux sacrifices internes, à l'action concertée des pays du bassin du lac Tchad et à l'assistance internationale, je peux affirmer haut et fort que la situation est aujourd'hui maîtrisée. Excellence, le haut-commissaire a dans son propos oral évoqué la situation sociopolitique dans les régions du nord-ouest et du sud-ouest du Cameroun. Je voudrais brièvement revenir sur son propos pour rappeler les contours de cette crise qui a été à plusieurs reprises présentée dans ce Conseil. D'emblée, je voudrais indiquer ici que la situation est sous contrôle et continue sa normalisation. Il y a lieu dans ces deux régions de souligner qu'il y a eu des velléités sécessionnistes qui ont complètement mué en des actes terroristes constitués d'enlèvement avec demande de rançon, d'assassinats ciblés, de règlement de comptes et de nombreux actes de brigandage. À titre d'illustration, la semaine dernière, des bandes terroristes ont froidement assassiné des populations civiles à Bouya, dans la région du sud-ouest, notamment des jeunes élèves, portant ainsi atteinte au droit à l'éducation, qui est un droit fondamental des droits de l'homme. Le gouvernement ne ménage aucun effort pour garantir l'exercice du droit à l'éducation et assurer la protection et la sécurité des personnes et des biens. Afin de résoudre durablement cette crise sociopolitique, le président de la République du Cameroun, son Excellence Paul Biya, a initié un grand dialogue national inclusif qui a débouché sur d'importantes mesures ayant pour objectif la restauration de la paix, la reconstruction du tissu économique et social détérioré, ainsi que le renforcement de la politique d'intégration nationale à travers le vivre ensemble harmonieux. Parmi ces mesures, on peut citer entre autres la nouvelle loi sur la décentralisation et l'octroi à ces deux régions d'un statut spécial et d'un statut de zone économique sinistrée. La mise en place d'un place d'assistance humanitaire au bénéfice des réfugiés et déplacés internes. La création d'un comité national de désarmement de démobilisation et de réintégration des terroristes repentis, DDR, l'élaboration du plan présidentiel de reconstruction et de développement de ces régions étendues à la région de l'extrême nord où Boko Haram fait continuellement des incursions en provenance des pays voisins. Je voudrais saisir cette occasion pour exprimer ici la gratitude du Cameroun envers nos partenaires bilatéraux et multilatéraux pour l'assistance dont ils continuent de nous gratifier, non sans apprécier l'action du Haut Commissariat aux droits de l'homme. Toutefois, c'est le lieu pour moi d'exprimer la vive préoccupation du Cameroun vis-à-vis de certains États et pays amis qui tolèrent encore que des auteurs criminels dûment identifiés se livrent impunément depuis les territoires à des achats d'armes et collectent des fonds pour financer le terrorisme et la violence, tout en encourageant également le développement des discours de haine au Cameroun. À ce stade, je voudrais me réjouir sincèrement de l'option prise par le gouvernement des États-Unis de poursuivre les promoteurs de ces crimes devant les juridictions nationales compétentes. Nous plaidons pour que d'autres pays puissent suivre cet exemple des droits de l'homme. C'est le lieu pour moi de souligner avec force que dans la gestion de cette crise, les forces de défense camerounaises sont restées professionnelles en appliquant les règles humanitaires en vigueur et en la matière, ce en dépit des agressions violentes qu'elles subissent au quotidien. Pour les cas de bavure avérés, les auteurs ont été traduits devant les juridictions compétentes. Monsieur le Président, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, l'agenda de la 54e session est un programme de travail pertinent, portant sur des problématiques qui nous interpellent tous. Soyez rassurés que ma délégation y participera comme à l'accoutumée de manière active et constructive afin que nos délibérations débouchent sur des perspectives heureuses pour le renforcement de la protection et la promotion des droits de l'homme dans le monde. Je vous remercie de votre écoute.
Merci à vous, monsieur, pour votre déclaration et pour votre présence parmi nous aujourd'hui. Colleagues, this is the end of this meeting. We will reconvene at 3 p.m. To continue the interactive dialogue on the written update of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on the situation of human rights in Sri Lanka, followed by the interactive dialogue on the oral update of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Afghanistan. So I'm closing the first meeting of 54th session of the Human Rights Council. I wish you good afternoon and bon appétit.